Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and before we get started on tonight's video, I'm going to tell you about Chilling. I've told you about Chilling before, and I'm going to do it again. Hey guys, check out Chilling. Chilling is an app available on Android, on iPhone, and all phone platforms. If you guys like listening to horror stories here, like I assume you do because, you're here, then you'll definitely love hearing the Chilling app. Chilling tells horror stories from all over the internet, and not just from me, even though I am on it, but a whole bunch of my other friends, such as AudionicMusic and many, many others. Chilling app also has this really cool feature called the ambient sound feature, which lets you change the background sounds and music, even a couple from Mew, and you guys will recognize his piano music from here. Also, this month, Chilling is doing an Xbox giveaway, so all you have to do is download Chilling, leave a review, and submit an entry form at thechillingapp.com/XboxX, and you can win an Xbox X. It's literally that easy. It's that simple. There's a whole bunch of new stuff going on in Chilling. There's new stories every single week, and hey, you're missing out if you're not checking it out yourself. So, there's a link in the description down below, and now, on to tonight's story. Jim Jameson grew some of the biggest and most unique pumpkins you'd ever seen. You've probably noticed them online without knowing that they were his. Every Halloween, when websites compete with one another to feature the spookiest content, you'd be hard-pressed not to find one of Jim's mammoth pumpkins carved into some kind of jack-o'-lantern. He was a local celebrity around here before he died, which was pretty sad for the whole town. The circumstances surrounding his death were well understood, but still bizarre and unfortunate. He had been working on trying to grow bigger and bigger pumpkins for shows and for his customers. And he'd been experimenting on the best ways to do it. The new method, which caused his death, was growing them in his greenhouse, suspended in the air by a series of cables. The pumpkins could grow and grow without having the ground to retard any of their progress. The method resulted in enormous, beautifully symmetrical pumpkins. And then one day, as Jim was working in the greenhouse, a pumpkin the size of a small car fell from the ceiling when its cable snapped, broke every bone that he had above his hip, and the rescue workers who extracted him from the mess of blood and pumpkin guts famously said they'd never be able to carve a pumpkin again. Jim had no next of kin, so the property was sold off along with everything on it. I was looking for a place in the area, and after a quick visit, I determined it was the best place for me. Moved in about a year ago. Moving into the home of someone who died, and seeing all their stuff sitting there more or less undisturbed, aside from the refrigerator being cleaned out, a few other maintenance-related things, it was a strange experience. At first, it felt a little invasive, going through Jim's belongings. There didn't appear to be anything too valuable. I figured whatever might have been there probably had just gotten taken by whoever cleaned the fridge. What I did find, though, were reams of paper and shelves of notebooks. Jim was a meticulous note-taker. Every possible pumpkin permutation was cataloged, diagrammed, and explained in full. I learned about his cable system, his fertilizer combinations, and even his experimental work. The experiments fascinated me. Jim had seen pictures of fruits and vegetables that had been coaxed into growing into particular shapes, square watermelons, star carrots, that kind of thing. But James' ambitions were greater than simple shapes. He wanted something unique and memorable, something that would put him on the map for more than just, big pumpkins. One of the notebooks was filled with diagrams of a scarecrow-shaped mold in which a pumpkin could be grown. He detailed the various materials he'd need to use, the methods of keeping the pumpkins properly watered, and even the various fertilizers that he'd used at different stages of its growth. Apparently, he'd been working on this experiment since the late 1980s, but with little success. Molds were created and destroyed over the course of the year, with new materials being introduced or rejected, depending on their efficiency. Same with irrigation methods, but fertilizer seemed to be the biggest problem for Jim. The plant wasn't getting the right amount of nourishment as it grew to fill the mold, leading to parts of it dying off and rotting. For decades, he tried. For decades, he failed. Whenever I had spare time, I read Jim's notebooks. I was fascinated by his experimenting and the trials and errors that he went through. I found myself wondering if his works could be published someday. I couldn't imagine anyone being bored by the work that he'd written about so passionately. And early last October, when the farm was turning brown and leaves were turning red, I cracked open a notebook of Jim's from the year that he died. I decided to skip a few because I was so anxious to learn if he had any success with the pumpkin experiment. Now, at this point in his notes, he was writing about hybrid pumpkins, pumpkin acorn, squash hybrids, pumpkin zucchini hybrids, all with the goal of solving the rot problem that had plagued his work. I flipped through the pages of the notebook, skimming the notes, until one word stood out from all the others as if it had been written in red: radiation. I turned back a few pages and was blown away by what I saw. Jim had, over time, purchased and disassembled hundreds of smoke detectors. He was planning to collect the tiny amounts of Americum-241 that they had inside. With wide eyes, I pored over the pages as Jim talked about incorporating the Americum-241 into his fertilizer to introduce mutations into the pumpkins. With each new entry, I saw that Jim began to have successes. He wrote about each complete shaped pumpkin with unbridled enthusiasm. I started to notice a slight disconnect between the scientifically meticulous Jim from before and the potentially irradiated Jim after. I finished that notebook and started the next one. The disconnect continued. More hypotheses about hybridization were detailed, including hybrids with ostriches and slugs and even dinosaurs. I groaned and I dropped the notebook. Poor bastard had gone nuts. I felt pity for the old farmer, and part of me wondered if his death in the greenhouse was purposely self-inflicted. If my mind was going, I might have done the same thing. I didn't read his notes for a couple weeks. On Halloween, feeling bored and waiting for it to get dark so I could give the trick-or-treaters a full-size candy bar, ones that I had bought to be the best neighbor ever, I picked up another one of Jim's notebooks. It was the last one that he'd ever made entries in. Now, the handwriting was terrible, and the sentences were fragmented. Still, I could get a decent idea about what he was talking about. More nonsense about hybrids, more trials with the Americum-241 fertilizer. There were drawings, too. And not just diagrams, but artistically rendered representations of his pumpkins and the imaginary hybrids. Some were actually pretty cool, like one of a scarecrow pumpkin riding an ostrich pumpkin. I mean, they're silly, yeah, but well drawn compared to his scrawled handwriting. The drawings tapered off as I got to the end of the notebook. One of the last pages before a series of blanks, there was a diagram. I held it up and I turned it around, trying to make out what it could be. And then it clicked. It was a map of the property. I saw the barn, the house, the greenhouse, but there was something there I didn't recognize, something in the middle of the field by the 3 scarecrows that had been there for what looked like decades. Still bored and now curious, I brought the map up to me with the field. Sure enough, at the center of the triangle formed by the scarecrows was a slight mound in the dirt. Easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. I kicked the dust around for a minute and saw a rope connected to a wooden hatch. I pulled it open, revealing a passage and a ladder anchored into the stone wall. I realized it had been probably a well at one point. I jogged back to the house, grabbed a flashlight. It was getting dark and I knew that it would be pitch black down there. I took care in climbing down the steps and reached the bottom after about 10 feet. Shallower than I thought. There was a narrow, low hallway with a dirt ceiling covered in the veiny stalactites of roots from the plants above. I stooped forward and brushed the roots out of my face, and trying to put out of my mind the thought of spiders as their webs struck me. My flashlight's beam illuminated another wooden door with a rope handle. I reached out, grabbed the handle, and pulled. It was stuck. I aimed the flashlight around the door and noticed a metal rod sticking out of the wall, blocking the door from opening. I yanked the rod out of the wall and tried the door again. It opened easily. The flashlight showed a small room about 5 feet by 5 feet. At first I thought that it was empty. When I stepped inside, however, there was something against the wall next to the doorway. It took me a minute to figure out what it was in the dim light of the flashlight, but when I finally understood what I was looking at, I gasped. The thing began to move. I stifled a scream as a creature the size of a man stood and stared at me, its veiny, whitish orange skin covered in dust. It moaned. I made a move to run, but the thing blocked my path. Now I screamed. I tried to strike it with my flashlight, but I was dealt a heavy blow that sent me reeling. The last thing I saw before I lost consciousness was the thing walking out of the door and down the root-choked corridor. My blackout lasted the entire night. When I came to, I rolled around in pain and confusion. I was seeing double and was unbearably dizzy. I knew I had to have a concussion, but for the first couple of minutes I couldn't remember why. When it all came flooding back, a spell of panic pushed my dizziness aside, and I ran out of the room, climbed out of the chamber, and hauled myself into the daylight. The farm was filled with police and emergency vehicles. One of the officers saw me staggering toward them and called out to his partner. They approached me in time for me to collapse into their arms. I woke in the hospital sometime later. I was indeed concussed, and my skull was home to a fracture that could have killed me. There was commotion outside the door, and I pressed the button near the bed to alert a nurse. When one finally came, she looked haggard and upset. I asked what was going on, dismayed by the slur that I had in my speech. She sat on my bed, and without breaking eye contact, she told me what had happened, and why the hospital was full. I didn't believe her, so she turned on the local news. The anchor was talking about deaths in our town, the death of trick-or-treaters, the dead parents who tried to protect them, dead police officers who tried to intervene. The view changed to a charred and fractured area of the middle of Main Street. It looked like a bomb had gone off. The nurse turned off the TV. The nurse said no one knew how any of that happened, and some people were even doubting what they'd seen less than 24 hours ago. It was too surreal. A man-shaped creature with skin like a pumpkin screaming, "Where is my father?" while devastating any person that came near. But the evidence was there, especially in the victims. The dead were lucky, the living though. The living were traumatized beyond comprehension. While I thought my injury was bad, as more details of the events were relayed, I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but it was short-lived. Before she left to assist with another patient, the nurse said one thing under her breath. It was quiet and almost sounded like she didn't want to say it, but felt compelled to. I didn't get all of it, but what I heard was enough. Shattered hips and jaws and orifices, stuffed with pumpkin seeds. It all started when Cassandra Wolfhart killed a pumpkin sprout. I didn't know Cassandra personally, but I knew of her. She was friends with Tom's sister, and Tom's, well, friends with me. All that I know about Cassandra, I've learned against my will, in passing comments from adults or other kids at school. That Wolfhart girl, now that's a picky eater if I've ever seen one. One thing that everyone in town knew was that Cassandra hated pumpkins. She literally could not stand the sight of them. I once watched her start screaming at the top of her lungs when a barista at the Point Pine Cafe offered her a pumpkin spice latte. That girl was weird. And her hatred of pumpkins was the weird cherry on top of the weird sundae that was Cassandra Wolfhart. Tom said that any time Cassandra came over during the fall season, she would avoid looking into her backyard. Apparently, the first time she went over, she saw their pumpkin patch and went white as a ghost before she passed out on the kitchen floor. He showed me a dent that he swears was made by her head hitting the wooden floorboards, but Tom's kind of a liar sometimes, so I just go along with most of what he says. I knew about the other girls at school who liked to play pranks on Cassandra. One time they filled her locker with pumpkin guts, and when she opened it, she threw up in the middle of the hallway. I have to say that at first, I found Cassandra to be a little ridiculous, but now I feel bad for her. So many people constantly terrorize her with their biggest fear. I think about what I would do if someone was dangling me off a cliff as a joke, and I realized that I'd probably react the same way that Cassandra has. Last week, I was at Tom's house while Cassandra was there hanging out with her sister, Megan. Even from Tom's room, I could overhear Cassandra complaining about pumpkin spice season. I even heard her gag a few times after she said the word pumpkin. Cassandra left before dinner that day once she found out that Tom's mother was serving pumpkin bread for dessert. Boy, that girl sure hates pumpkins, Tom's dad chuckled as she went out the front door. A few days after that, Cassandra's brother managed to carry her to Tom's pumpkin patch in her sleep, and when she woke up surrounded by pumpkins, she screamed so loud that she woke up everyone in the neighborhood. They all rushed out to find her, slamming her fists over the pumpkins, punching holes into a few of them. She had apparently broken off a few nails doing this, and severely cut up and bruised her hands in the process. They had to call the police and the paramedics to tear her away from the pumpkin patch, and then sedate her, so they could transport her to the hospital. Since her brothers had filmed it, they were in some big trouble with the cops and their parents. May said she tried to go visit Cassandra, but she wouldn't even talk to her. She just kept crying, saying the pumpkins were going to want revenge, Tom said, as we did our history homework. Revenge for what? For what she did to them, duh. She basically murdered a bunch of pumpkins. I saw what it looked like afterward. She literally destroyed our whole pumpkin patch. I looked up at Tom, who was highlighting in a textbook. Yeah, but they're pumpkins. They don't care, I replied. She doesn't think that, he mumbled, with a highlighter cap in his mouth. I didn't hear much about Cassandra for the rest of the day. But the following morning, when Tom's parents were outside to clean up the mess, they found that all the pumpkin debris was already gone. You mean someone just cleaned it up? I asked Tom over the phone. I mean, I guess. What else could have happened? I didn't say anything because, honestly, I didn't know. Maybe someone just felt bad and had decided to help Tom's family by cleaning up Cassandra's mess. It wasn't likely that she would clean up after herself, at least not without having some sort of breakdown. The following morning at 4 a.m., someone called the police claiming that there was a girl in a hospital gown wailing and running barefoot down the street. It was Cassandra. When they caught up to her, she said she was running from the pumpkin monster. She had made it all the way to our neighborhood from the hospital and collapsed on her front lawn. I watched through my bedroom window as the police talked to Cassandra and her parents for a few minutes. Something caught my eye off to the left, and I looked over to see Tom waving me down. I ran downstairs and out the front door to meet him. What's going on? I asked. He says there's a pumpkin monster out here to get her, Tom grinned. Maybe all the teasing caught up to her and she finally broke. I looked over at the rest of the neighbors who had been drawn outside onto the street by the cops and the crazy girl in the hospital gown. Or maybe not, Tom trailed off. I glanced back at him and saw that he was pointing towards one of the running paths that came out of the woods. Between two of the houses on the street, there was movement in the trees and a flash of orange before something came out of the woods. The fuck is that? I asked. Oh my god, it's here! The pumpkin monster's here! Please, you have to help me! I don't want to die! Cassandra wailed as she saw it. And for once, Cassandra wasn't crazy. The thing that had come out of the woods was, in fact, a pumpkin monster. It was about 7 feet tall and made out of the broken pumpkins from Tom's pumpkin patch. The pumpkin pieces were crudely molded together to form feet, legs, a torso, arms, hands, a neck, and finally a head. It had pumpkin guts draped all over it, hanging off its body and leaving a trail of them all over the ground. It stopped in the middle of the street and people began to go back into their homes. It seemed to look around for a while, moving its lopsided, half-smashed pumpkin head from side to side, even though it had no eyes or any other facial features. After a few seconds, it headed straight towards Cassandra, who screamed so loud I thought my eardrums were going to burst. It began to awkwardly make its way towards her home, taking wide steps and fumbling as it tried to speed up. Oh, hell no. It shook the ground with each step, and I held on to a nearby fence for balance. The police pulled out their guns and shot it a few times, but it continued to walk, unfazed. Cassandra darted between two of the officers and headed towards Tom and me. What is she doing? Why is she running this way? Tom asked. The pumpkin monster pivoted and began making its way towards us as usual. Cassandra ran past us, looking back towards the monster for a second. She continued to run down the street, and Tom and I moved out of the monster's way as it chased her. After a few seconds, Tom took off after it as well. Where are you going? I asked. Don't you want to see what happens? I hesitated for a second before I followed. Hey, come back here! An officer called after us. We made it to the end of the street just in time to see Cassandra trip and roll down the small hill. We stopped and we listened to her screams as she kept rolling down the hill. No fucking way, Tom whispered. We kept watching as Cassandra rolled straight into another pumpkin patch. her head making contact with the biggest pumpkin and slamming right into it with a dull thud. Oh my god. She's dead. The pumpkin monster tripped down the field, falling over Cassandra's lifeless body and falling apart all over her and the pumpkin patch. The cops finally caught up and raced down the hill to check on Cassandra. But I was right. And she had died. Not even an hour later, there was a town-wide announcement. No more pumpkins in Point Pine. Ever. Tom and I watched from the top of the hill as people carried the pumpkins away to burn them all at the edge of town. Someone had already taken Cassandra's body away, but left the pumpkin that her head had smashed through. For days, all that anyone talked about was Cassandra's freak accident. That night, Cassandra was seen again. Multiple people reported seeing her walking around town, sobbing, asking for help. I was one of them. See, I heard her crying in the middle of the night. Looked out my bedroom window to see her standing in the middle of the road, right outside her house. She was dirty and bruised, covered in pumpkin guts and dried up blood. She cried loudly, gasping for breath while she cried out. "Someone please help me! Please, I hate pumpkins!" I continued to watch as no one, not even her parents, turned on their lights or even looked outside. Cassandra fell to her knees in the middle of the road, continuing to cry. Before finally falling face first, her forehead pressed to the road. "Please. I hate them," she cried. She continued to cry for a few minutes, and then backed away from the window and got into bed. After a few minutes, she started to scream. She's done this every single night since she's died. She screams about how we should have listened to her. Getting rid of the pumpkins now won't stop anything. She claims they'll come back, and that we're all going to die. I guess one thing that kind of sucks about Point Pine is that the dead never really leave. I was 13 when I had my first pumpkin spice latte. Dad had taken me to Starbucks on the way to school, and as soon as we walked in, I saw their posters advertising the drink. Everything about the ad screamed warmth. The mug it showcased was a gentle beige, contrasting sweetly against the light brown wood of a table on which it sat, surrounded by artistically placed autumn leaves, festive gourds. The contents of the mug were centered in the image, showing off the perfect dollop of creamy foam with caramely tints of espresso running through it. At the top, lovingly whispered by the deft hand of a skilled, caring barista, was a sprinkling of nutmeg. It called to me. I eschewed my normal caramel macchiato and requested a grande pumpkin spice latte. I waited anxiously with Dad by my side. He sipped his black coffee and suggested that we sit for a while. We were running early for once. I sat, shaking my leg with anticipatory excitement. The cafe smelled different that day. I'd grown accustomed to the thick, imposing aroma of dark roasted coffee, and the occasional hint of sweetness as a customer's blueberry muffin was toasted. That day, though, gripping the reins of the dark roast and riding it into a new and alluring place was something else. Something exotic. My head swam as I realized the exotic smell was, in fact, the spicy aroma of ingredients within a pumpkin spice latte. The same pumpkin spice latte I'd soon taste. After what felt like an eternity, my order was ready. Alexandra, the barista, waved me over. I did my best to avoid sprinting, but my rush was obvious. "Easy there," Dad called. I slowed down a bit and I giggled. I reached the counter and accepted my drink. In the tiny mouth of the lid, I could see the sprinkled spices adorning the cap of warm foam. With my eyes closed, I inhaled the steam rising from the hole, The scent was an embrace from a ghost, a non-corporeal expression of love and comfort. The first sip was transcendental. At that moment, I knew what it felt like to believe in something bigger than myself. Each day before school, Dad would take me to Starbucks to get another pumpkin spice latte. Its effect on me didn't dull, nor did it taste any less special. As early autumn reds decayed into late autumn browns, I found my mood better than it had been in my entire short life. I never knew it was so easy to be happy. At 12:51 a.m. on December 1st, 2005, Dad and I walked into a Starbucks. At 12:52 a.m. on December 1st, 2005, my happiness was torn from my chest and dashed against the rocks. The pumpkin spice latte was a limited time product. Alexander told me it'd be back just in time for fall next year, then asked if I'd like to go to my caramel macchiato. Entombed in disbelief and disappointment, I nodded. The following days were a blur of grays. My vivacity had been strangled. Dad would ask over and over what he could do to make me happy. I didn't need to tell him, though. He knew, and there was nothing he could do about it. December slouched towards Christmas, a holiday I'd always loved. Not anymore, though. Now that I'd seen the world through a lens of happiness and warmth, nothing looked the same without it. Quite the contrary, it all looked fake, vulgar. When I closed my eyes on Christmas Eve, I prayed for Santa to bring me blindness or death. On Christmas morning, I woke up to Dad standing next to my bed. That was a little tradition that he and I had before Mom passed away. They'd come up, and shake me awake, and carry me downstairs to see what Santa had brought. Now that it was just the two of us here, he wanted to keep the tradition going. Even in my despondence, I still appreciated it. Dad held my hand and we headed down the steps, and tears had started to flow without me knowing we'd reached the Christmas tree in the living room. Only one present stood underneath. It was small and wrapped with bright green paper. When I looked at Dad with confusion, he just smiled and beckoned the gift. I sat cross-legged under the tree and tore away the paper, and my soft weeping grew into pitiful bleats. "Why would you do this?" I whispered to Dad, my breathing heavy with sobs. In my lap beneath the shiny torn paper was a cheery autumnal Starbucks. The same one from the poster I'd seen on that transformative day. I was baffled and hurt, but Dad stood still smiling. "Come with me." I obeyed and I rose to my feet. Following his long stride out of the living room, down the hallway into the kitchen, Dad looked into my misty eyes and whispered, "Merry Christmas." He opened the cellar door. A faint but familiar and exquisite aroma entered me. In my surprise, I nearly dropped my present. "Why don't you go see what Santa brought you?" Dad suggested. I ran down the 14 steps with the same enthusiasm I had when I ran across Starbucks to receive my very first pumpkin spice latte. This time, Dad didn't tell me to slow down. I reached the bottom, I turned the corner, and there, on a makeshift bar, was a new espresso machine. I gasped. Behind the bar, manning the machine, was Alexander, the barista. He smiled and stared wide-eyed as Dad reached the bottom stair, and he placed himself by my side. "Go ahead. Tell the nice man what you'd like." My voice quivered at first, but I finished my request with enthusiasm and strength. "May I please have a pumpkin spice latte?" Alexander, still smiling, nodded. He began to work. The coffee was ground, and thick espresso drooled out of the machine into the bottom of the mug. With a hiss of steam, the milk was frothed. Warm milk joined the espresso in the mug, followed by a generous dollop of ethereal foam, and then Alexander picked up a large shaker. I knew what had to be inside. With 3 exact shakes, a pixie dust of pumpkin spice kissed the foamy head of the latte. He picked up my mug and he held it out. I walked up to the bar, carefully took the mug from Alexander's hand, and I thanked him. I noticed for the first time he didn't have any legs, and he was strapped to a rolling stool. "Sorry about your accident, Alexander," I said with sincerity. He didn't say anything, but he kept smiling. I saw a small cut in his neck. I wondered if his accident had made it so that he couldn't talk anymore. "Well, Merry Christmas," I told him. And he stared at Dad. I took a sip from the mug, and for the first time in nearly a month, it seemed like I could see in color again. The world felt right, and I was happy. My tears were drying as I took Dad's hand. We turned the corner and headed up the steps. We reached the landing, and Dad switched off the basement light that he always hated to waste electricity with. "You can have one every morning now," Dad informed me, As long as I'm around, I'll make sure you get whatever you need. I hugged him, feeling the warmth of his body against mine. It was nearly as pleasant as the mug against my palm. He was right, too. Things have been wonderful ever since.
October's a pretty solemn affair in Pacific Glade. The rest of the country loves this time of year, an excuse to embrace their inner darkness, to turn the very real horrors of the world into bedsheet ghosts and warty witches and things that go bump in the night. But our town has ghosts of a different kind. They sit at our kitchen tables. They walk the sidewalks with us. They wrap us in their phantom arms as we lie awake in bed, missing them. Disaster does that to a town. It's been over a year since the quake that ripped through the Neverglades, and by now, we've repaired what can be repaired. Homes have been rebuilt. Schools are back in session. The Hanging Rock is once again serving drinks and getting the good people of Pacific Glade shit-faced on Saturday nights. But for the people who lost friends and family in the quake, people like me, there's still a broken piece in us. A piece that even time hasn't been able to set properly. So for us, October is a time to remember. All the spooks of the season can't hold a candle to the legacy of the dead. My son Stephen has grown apathetic towards Halloween over the last couple of years. Something about being a high school senior has made him too cool for it, I expect. But he still loves the tradition of picking out a pumpkin for the front stoop. Sheriff Marconi and her wife Janine came with us this year to find the perfect one. The farm down on Minnow Street had a nice selection as we wandered down the rows, sipping hot cider and hunkering in our jackets. I felt a little of the seasonal sadness leave me. Stephen and I had been left aimless after the quake, but Gladers look after their own, and Olivia and Janine had offered us something we'd lost, a home. We were a makeshift family, brought together by tragedy, but even a makeshift family has its own familiar comforts. The fragrant aromas of Janine's cooking, the white noise Olivia uses to fall asleep, the swing in the backyard where Stephen often goes to read. We've fallen into a routine that's easy, natural. It's not the same as it used to be, but it's home. Sometimes I go down to Locklear Cemetery to visit my other family. Stephen hasn't come with me in several months. Of the two of us, I think I've always had the harder time letting go. So when I went the other day, it was just me winding my way through the gravestones. The afternoon was heavy with that late October chill. I clutched the flowers I'd brought and wrapped my coat tightly around me. Leaves were strewn across the ground in front of my husband's grave, so I brushed them aside. There was already a bushel of flowers laid beneath his headstone. Each petal was a bright, vivid purple, and I knew the inspector had been here. Mark's old partner on the force. He'd been a regular presence in Olivia's house ever since Mark's death, coming over to sit with us at meals or tell us stories of his latest case. I didn't know he'd been a visitor here as well. Somehow, I had a hard time imagining the inspector, in all his stoicism, feeling grief. I guess there was more of a man in him than I'd thought. I plucked a few flowers from my own bushel and laid them on Mark's grave. Then I placed the rest of the bunch beneath Rory's headstone. My son, too, had his own display of purple petals, and I was touched at the inspector's thoughtfulness. I brushed a bit of lichen from the letters in his name. Then I left my family there, slumbering quietly to return home for the night. When the inspector told us the next morning that he was throwing a Halloween party for the police force, you could have heard a pin drop. He couldn't have shocked the room more if he'd announced he was running for president. Everyone in the kitchen stopped what they were doing to turn and look at him. Olivia nearly choked on her cup of coffee. "Seriously?" she asked, wiping her lips with a sleeve. "I mean, sorry, Inspector, that was rude. You just don't seem like the party type." An understatement if I'd ever heard one. The inspector was tall, thin, and gray as a statue, and he spent most of his time hidden in a cloud of smoke from his ever-present cigar. He was a friend, family even, and our town owed him a tremendous debt, but his shadow still darkened every room he stepped into, and his presence had a foreboding quality, like he was always about to deliver bad news. "Morale has been low," he said in his gravelly voice. "Not just at the station, but all over town. I thought it might be good to get everyone in the spirit of the season, to remind us that it's still okay to have fun and enjoy each other's company." "It's not going to be, actually scary, right?" Stephen asked. He had paused in the middle of his bowl of cereal. "Like your usual kind of stuff?" We all knew what Stephen meant. Unnatural things were drawn to the inspector like a magnet, and there was no telling what otherworldly beings might poke their faces out of the veil this time. But the inspector didn't seem concerned. His lips curled into a smile around his cigar. "I may give it something of my usual flair," he replied, "but it'll be safe, clean, fun. I promise you that." I went back to drying dishes. Somehow, I had a hard time believing him. The inspector was tight-lipped about his party plans all week, leaving the rest of us to speculate. As members of the sheriff's household, Stephen and I were included in the invitation, so we hastily got to work making our costumes. Stephen put in as little effort as possible. He repurposed an old curtain as a cape and called himself a teething vampire. But I hadn't dressed up for the holiday in years, and I wanted something a little more decorative. I spent the majority of my free time this week down at Ingram's craft store, putting all the pieces together. At first, I wasn't sure what I was doing. I played with different materials, sewing strips of felt onto fabric, running my fingers through the buckets of fake jewelry. Eventually, an idea took shape. I wasn't sure where it had come from, and it was a bit strange, but it felt right. I think Mark would have appreciated it. I sewed a ring of felt trees around the base of a dark blue dress, then peppered the fabric above with little superglue stars. For authenticity, I took a few crinkly leaves from the ground outside and pasted them in patterns across the dress. Then I draped a plastic full moon pendant around my neck. A pair of purple contact lenses completed the picture. The day of the party arrived, and we all gathered in the kitchen to head out together. The inspector looked as gray and looming as ever. He hadn't bothered to trade out of his trademark trench coat or fedora, but his cigar now issued puffs of orange smoke. So, at least he was getting into the season. Stephen stood in the corner, bored, tugging on the edge of his vampire cape. "What are you supposed to be?" Olivia asked. She had simply changed into her sheriff's uniform, which I guess was a costume of sorts. Janine had applied copious amounts of white face paint and put on a threadbare wedding dress. I gave my own dress a little twirl. The fabric rustled like wind through the trees. "I'm the Neverglades," I answered. I don't think I'd ever seen a smile so broad on the inspector's face. The inspector had transformed the Hanging Rock from an unassuming bar and diner into something out of a macabre dream. Cobwebs filled with all sorts of skittering creatures stretched from wall to wall. 4 obelisks covered with spiky runes and symbols jutted from each corner of the room. A low moaning issued from each one. The tables had been pushed aside to create a makeshift dance floor, which swirled with clouds of mist and flashing orange lights. People were milling around with drinks clutched in their hands, admiring the decorations. "Check out the apple bobbing," Nico Sanchez told me as he wandered by. "Gave me a fucking heart attack." He seemed pretty pleased by whatever had scared him. He was dressed like a lumberjack, all plaid in overalls, and he carried a cheap plastic axe. I caught sight of his girlfriend, Abigail, chatting with Janine by one of the obelisks. She wore fox ears and a bushy red tail. Curious, I headed over to the apple tank and brushed a hand through the water. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, so I held my breath and dunked my head in. A coldness rushed over me at once, along with a stomach-lurching sense of depth. Any thoughts about apples were forgotten. The tank plunged down hundreds of feet into a fiery pit, where a salamander creature with 6 orange heads and an enormous tail slithered around the rock formations. It caught me staring and roared up at me with 3 of its heads. I drew back immediately, dripping, my heart pounding like a drum. Oh, I see you spared no expenses, I told the passing inspector. He grinned and handed me a towel to dry my hair. Just trying to spice things up, he said. Check out one of the mirrors when you get the chance, won't you? I'm particularly proud of those. I said I would, and left him to go mingle. As the inspector had hoped, people seemed to be genuinely enjoying themselves, swapping stories about their weekend and praising the inspector's attention to detail. He was right. Morale had been low in the police force recently. I could see it in the heaviness Olivia brought home every night, in the general malaise every time I visited the station. But the party seemed to have reminded everyone that celebrating was okay, that there could still be fun and laughter and happiness, even when things felt bleak. I was grateful to the inspector for showing us that much. I caught Stephen slipping cups of spiked punch and slapped him gently on the wrist. But I wasn't actually mad. The boy was going to college soon, and a little drinking now was hardly the worst thing in the world. I left him to sip and chat with Olivia and wandered away from the hub of the party, peering down a side hallway. The inspector had lined the walls with mirrors of every size and shape, some round and simple, others long and ornate, with rims that swirled and curved like water turned to metal. I approached one of the smaller ones and stared into it. For a second, my reflection looked the same. Then, its jaw began to stretch, its eyes rolling back in its head, its tongue vibrating with the force of a silent scream. It was a neat trick. I was about to go look into another one when a face appeared over my reflection's shoulder. It was a face I knew. Shortly cropped brown hair, blue eyes, a nose slightly off-center from when it was broken in a police scuffle many years ago. Mark was standing right behind me. I whirled around. The hall was empty, but I could feel something hot and painful squeezing my heart. "Hello?" I called. My voice came out as a croak. The mirrors glimmered in the light from the party room, but otherwise, there was no reply. I wandered back into the crowd and found the inspector talking idly with an officer I didn't know. If anyone had answers, it would be him. I pulled him away from the officer with a slight apology and brought him over to the side hallway. There was the slightest of smile still plastered on his face. "Do you think this is funny?" I hissed. His brow grew furrowed. "What are you talking about?" I took him by the arm and dragged him over to the mirror. Our faces went through their visual cues, chins elongating, eyes turning white, mouths opening in screams of terror. But this time, there was no sign of Mark over my shoulder. I touched a hand to the glass. I don't understand," I whispered. I thought... A cry of disgust from the next room cut me off. The voice was loud, angry, and it sounded like Nico Sanchez. "What kind of fucked up joke is this?" The inspector and I left the mirror and hurried to the source of the noise. A circle had formed in the middle of the party room, and in its center stood a man in fire-seared clothing. Hushed muttering ran through the crowd. The man stood slouched, off-kilter, one shoulder higher than the other. His skin was smoldering slightly. Everything about him gave off a subtle blue glow, like his body was made of neon. I would recognize that figure anywhere. Something inside of me, something I hadn't known was there, withered at the sight of him. "You're sick," Nico spat. "Who do you think you are, dressing up like him? Do you not see how fucked up that is?" He took a step forward, brandishing his plastic axe. Abigail hovered just behind him. My husband, or whoever was dressed like him, made no reply. I couldn't see his face from where I was standing. His head tilted ever so slightly, and he took a step toward the furious Nico. His glowing hand reached up and grabbed the hilt of Nico's prop axe. Nico made a move to yank it away, but Mark's grip tightened. Nico's face blanched at the sudden pressure. Before the eyes of everyone in the room, tongues of blue fire crept from Mark's hands and encircled the axe, spreading from top to bottom. The plastic handle turned to thick, knobby wood. The cheap blade at the tip became wickedly sharp. I took a step back, feeling faint, as the shadow of my husband wrenched the axe out of Nico's hand. "What are you?" Nico started. Then the figure swung around and buried the axe in Nico's portly chest. Abigail screamed. Nico looked down at the blade protruding from his stomach with something like dull surprise. I don't think he had fully registered what was happening. Mark pulled at the axe, sending a spray of dark blood across the floor before swinging back for another whack. The room devolved into chaos. People swarmed over one another, some throwing themselves at the axe-wielding figure, trying to pull him away from Nico, others fleeing toward the exits. I heard another scream and a sickening squelch as the axe found a home in someone's neck. The inspector grabbed me by the arm and dragged me away from the carnage. "Stephen!" I cried, and for a second I was terrified that he was in the middle of that swarm, buried under flailing arms and waves of blood, and then, out of nowhere, he was hurrying after us, his cape flap behind him as he ran. The inspector ushered us into a side hallway and gestured for us to be quiet. "That wasn't... Who was that?" I whispered. I could feel my hands starting to tremble. Stephen had big tears welling up in his eyes, and it looked like he might start sobbing at any minute. "It's not Mark," the inspector assured me, but even he looked distraught, and he kept shooting glances back towards the scene of the crime. "That thing out there, it calls itself the Semblance. It was an enemy of mine a long time ago. I managed to seal it away, deep in a world without light or sound, and for centuries now I thought it had gone dormant, but something must have agitated it." "Why does it look like Dad?" Stephen choked out. "It's like a walking mirror," the inspector said. "It makes reflections real. I've never seen its true face because it wears people like masks, and a whole room of people pretending to be something they're not." He looked behind him, where the screams of fear and pain still issued. "It can create dozens of warped reflections. The Semblance will have a field day in there." "How do we stop it?" I asked. "It won't be easy," the inspector replied. "We have to corner it, drive it back to the dimension that it came from. Only then can I try to seal it up again. We just need to..." He stopped mid-sentence. His eyes took on an odd, glassy sheen, and for a second I thought he'd noticed something behind me. Then a raspy moan came from his throat. I clutched Stephen and watched, horrified, as the inspector's skin calcified, turning hard as stone. It spread up his arms and neck like a rash, his lips frozen in a pure expression of shock. His eyes turned into purple orbs of glass. In seconds, his body had gone entirely still. I could only stare and think numbly about all the times I'd thought that the inspector looked like a statue. Now he'd become one. "Mom!" Stephen cried. He'd let go of my arm and was scrabbling at his mouth, pulling his lips apart with his fingers. His canine teeth looked sharper than usual. As the seconds passed, they grew noticeably more razor-like until a clear set of fangs had sprouted from his jaw. His eyes became wide and bloodshot. He looked at me, and I saw a shudder pass through his body. "Stephen," I said. "Run," he whispered. Then he lunged at me, teeth bared, and I acted without thinking. I swerved around him and pushed through an open door, slamming and locking it behind him. His fists pounded furiously against the wood, accompanied by a guttural snarl that should never have come from my boy's throat. I backed up slowly. The inspector's statue blocked out all ambient light from the next room, casting a long shadow across the hall. I realized suddenly that the lightning wasn't just atmosphere. It was a bright neon blue, and it emanated from a figure standing at the far end of the corridor. He skirted around the inspector and took a few steps towards me, swinging Nico's axe like a baseball bat. His mouth was curled up into a grin so wide it stretched the limits of his cheeks. His eyes were a solid blue. No irises or pupils. I had never seen such a gruesome expression on my husband's face. "Oh, Ruth," he said, in a voice that sounded like 1,000 buzzing gnats. "Sweet, sweet Ruth, I've heard so much about you." Swish, swish. The axe was mesmerizing, gleaming with each swing. "You have, huh?" I said. I don't think I'd ever been so scared in my life, but I forced myself to project an air of false confidence. "And where have you been getting your information?" "I think you know," he smirked. "It's a little endearing, honestly, how he won't shut up about you. I wonder what he'll say when he learns what I've done to you and your precious ones." His smile grew even wider, the skin splitting around his lips. He stopped swinging the axe. "Mark?" I uttered. Then I felt a wave of unexplained nausea, and I could feel myself unspooling, like a tangle of thread coming undone. I stumbled against the wall to keep myself from falling over. I could feel the atoms in my body exploding outward like a scattershot of shrapnel, and a realization washed over me, cold and horrible. The semblance had seen my reflection and brought it to life. Tonight, I was the Neverglades. I was becoming the town, the night sky, the grass and trees and streets and houses. Soon there would be none of me left. My body snapped back together like a magnet, yanking each particle into place, and I staggered back to my feet. The monster wearing my husband's face had stumbled. He dropped the axe as Olivia approached from behind him and emptied the contents of her pistol into his back, causing sprays of neon blue blood to splatter across the floor. I don't think I'd ever seen such grim darkness in her eyes. I darted forward and snatched up the axe, and before I could stop myself, I brought the blade down on Mark's neck. The entity roared with waspy pain as the metal dug into his skin and collided with bone. I brought back the axe and whacked him again, and again, and again, until his head was hanging by the barest of sinews, and then it was rolling across the hall, dead eyes wide and surprised. I gripped the weapon in trembling hands and breathed in deep, heavy. I couldn't let go of the axe. I thought I might crumble if I did. "Is it dead?" Olivia asked, poking the body with her gun. The severed head suddenly rolled itself down the length of the hall. It sprouted a torso, then a pair of arms, then 2 short, lanky legs, shooting upward like some hideous plant. Olivia reached into her jacket for some more ammunition, but the semblance was already turning a doorknob at the far end of the hall. I'd never seen that door before. In fact, I was fairly certain that there had been a bare stretch of wallpaper there just a minute ago. The door was made of a gray, stained wood and had a strange rune carved in its center. "Don't let it get away!" Olivia cried. Then it turned to me. The entity was wearing a new face, and this time I felt more than just a withering. My heart let out a deep, throbbing ache, and I felt hotness sear my eyes. Rory, my son, my poor, departed son, stared back at me with those solid blue eyes. He flashed me a wicked smile, and then he flung open the door and darted inside, slamming it shut behind him. The door itself was gone in the half-second it took me to blink. "Shit!" Olivia swore. I couldn't bring myself to speak. Stephen's pounding had lessened, and his raspy growl had been replaced by a soft sobbing, the sound of a young man reduced to frightened tears. The inspector was coming back to life with a crack of splitting stone. He rose to his full height, moving stiffly, shaking bits of pebble from his coat and skin. Mark's headless body lay at my feet. The glow had faded entirely, and it looked like the borrowed form was already starting to deteriorate. The skin had turned a pasty gray and begun melting into the floorboards. "The semblance must have fled then," the inspector said. "Did you see where it went?" "Through a door," I said faintly. "It's not there anymore. I don't know where it went." The inspector's face grew solemn. "It's gone somewhere out of my reach, somewhere no one can follow. Let's hope you managed to weaken it. We'll just have to be extra vigilant in case it decides to slip back through again." I stared down at the desiccated body, the entity's words going through my head like rushing water. It's a little endearing, honestly, how he won't shut up about you. Was there some part of Mark still out there? In some unknown place? Or had the semblance just been toying with me? I wanted to fall to my knees, to weep at the sight of the husband that I'd lost for a second time, but that wouldn't help anybody now. I moved like a sleepwalker to let Stephen out of his prison. He emerged red-eyed from crying and wrapped me in the tight hug of a fearful child. Then Olivia, the inspector, my son, and I returned to the scene of the party, to mourn Nico Sanchez, to tend to the scared and wounded, and to salvage what little we could from this night.
Am I going to be charged with murder? The detective sighed and didn't answer. His eyes were tired, haunted. Just help us get to the bottom of this, he said. Okay, I replied. I'll do my best. I could hear the tremor in my voice. I hadn't stopped shaking since it happened. I had a strong drink to settle my nerves. It hadn't worked. Let's start at the beginning, said the detective. You were having a Halloween party. Yeah, I said. We do it every year. We take turns hosting and the whole block participates. This year it was our turn. So you're the one who set up the decorations? Yeah, I said. Oh God, that sounds bad, but it wasn't just me, it was lots of people. I was mostly just supervising. All right, well, can you give me a list of who was involved? Yeah, it was, I'm sorry, I'm all over the place. Just give me a moment to calm down. I can give you the list. It's okay, we'll come back to that. Okay. So, who was it that set up the scarecrow? It was me, I said. But I didn't, oh God, I mean, okay, I didn't do that. I set it up the night before. Someone must have come in during the night and, oh God. The room swayed and my breath came fast and sharp. My heart ratcheted up its pace to breakneck speed, and darkness began to close in around my vision. Hey, the detective said, just calm down, you're hyperventilating. I'd take long, calm breaths. I did as he said. My heart slowed, but the panic remained. Okay, thanks, I said. Think you can keep going? He asked. Yeah, I said, just give me a moment. My body convulsed with tremors, but in a few minutes they had settled down to a mild shaking in my hands. I gulped down a hard knot in my throat. Okay, I said, I'm ready. So, the scarecrow, the detective prompted. The word filled me with dread. The scarecrow, I repeated, numbly. It's a Halloween tradition. The neighbors said as much. You destroy it every year? Yeah, I said. Usually it's filled with candy and straw like a piñata. The kids beat it with sticks and everyone has a good time. I just don't understand, God, why someone would do that. Yeah, it's too early to speculate, said the detective. Right now, we're just gathering the facts. When did you notice that something was wrong? Well, right away I noticed that the scarecrow wasn't coming apart as easily as it should have been, but I thought that I just put it together too well, so I grabbed a stick and, yeah. I took a swing. The detective leaned forward. And then what happened? My shoulders slumped, my mouth was cottony and dry. And then, I said, then the scarecrow began to bleed, and, there was a pregnant pause. The detective's eyes bore into mine, willing me to continue. He said nothing, and I had to fill the silence. It fell over, I said. The hat came off when we saw it was a body. What happened then? kids started screaming. One girl started it, the Oakley girl, I think, and they all went off. We, the other parents and I, we pulled them all away, we called the police. Well, that's it, you know the rest. The detective scribbled his last note and closed the fold-top notebook he'd been writing in. His eyes were hard, dull gray stone, impossible to read. When he spoke next, his words were measured, careful. His voice was soft. "What interests me, Mr. Johnson," he said, "is that you haven't asked about your wife." The question caught me completely off guard. My wife?" I said. She's out of town." "Oh God, she's going to freak out when she finds out what happened. She hates the block Halloween party enough as it is." "Your wife is out of town?" prodded the detective. The question poked a fresh wound. "Yes," I said, forgetting my fear in a moment of irritation. She and my son are spending the holiday with her parents in Virginia." "Well, that seems strange," the detective said. "A family spending a holiday apart." I got the feeling he knew something more than he was letting on. Have you talked to her?" I said. "I'd like to hear your side." My wife and I are going through a rough patch right now," I said, "but I don't see why this is relevant. It's our job to gather all the information. Then we can decide what is and is not relevant. Why is your wife not spending the holiday with you?" I sighed. I wasn't proud of it, but I was getting flustered. I could feel hot blood rising into my face. We're separated." "Why is that?" It's personal. Your wife said that it was related to infidelity." "Okay, so you have talked to her." "Yes." "Fine. You know, I cheated on my wife. I destroyed our family. It's all my fault. Now I've had a hell of a day, so if you don't mind, can you please tell me what the hell this has to do with anything?" The detective paused. He spoke softly. "Your wife is in police custody, Mr. Johnson." "What?" "I'm sorry I have to tell you this. She's rendered a full confession." A full confession? A confession of what? What the hell are you talking about?" "Well, it happens occasionally in cases of separation. One party feels they need to punish the other, but unfortunately the children are sometimes used as a tool to that end." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The room swam. Bile rose in my throat. Oh God. Oh God. "I'm afraid that we've positively identified the remains as belonging to your son, Ben." The scream died in my throat. I blacked out. Halloween is my favorite time of year, more than anything. I love decorating my front yard. It started when I was a kid. My parents always had elaborate decorations, and I kept the trend going with my own family. It bonded us. I love doing it. On top of that, my neighborhood had a bit of a reputation for going all out on Halloween time. It was a perfect fit. When we first moved into the neighborhood, we kind of set the standard for decorations. My graveyard scenes were always elaborate, but when we moved into the house, I went above and beyond. I added touches of flair, lights, smoke, some small animatronics, really made a life-size diorama out of it. I easily won the challenge the first 5 years, but after the 5th year, everyone else on our street upped their games. Before too long, our street was the most trick-or-treated street in the town. Honestly, it was a sight to behold. So many people coming together to scare the living hell out of each other. It was sweet, in a horror movie kind of way. It was around this time that the Johnsons moved in down the street. Tom and Joyce and their little boy Joey. The nicest people. His wife makes an amazing lemon bar, and we're great friends. 11 months out of the year. But around Halloween time, the Johnsons become my sworn enemy. Tom and Joyce work for a theme park. I'll let you guess which one. And they went all out at the holidays. The first year, they had their own graveyard scene that was, to be honest, nothing short of amazing. It far outdid my unearthed graves. It was clear they won the contest. I took it in stride, but the next day I started planning what I could do for the following year. That was petty, I know, but I wanted to win. I lost 5 years running. Last week at a barbecue, Tom let it slip that they were working on a lab scene. I had tried that the last few years, but the results were mixed. I decided that I wanted to go back to a graveyard scene. In my spare time, I'd been looking at how-to videos about creating more lifelike decorations, how to build cheap but effective animatronics, scouring Craigslist for supplies, and looking up various Pinterest boards. I know, I wanted to punch myself too, in order to have the better-looking yard. I felt that with all the decorations I already had, the ones I found on Craigslist, and my new knowledge, I was ready to win it all again. The Johnsons be damned, this was my year. The week before I was going to break out the decorations and get started, we had one of the most intense thunderstorms we've ever had in these parts. I felt like any minute I'd look out my window and see the Wicked Witch flying on a broom. We made plans just in case a tornado touched down, but nothing but hard rain fell. When the storm ceased, I went into my garage to prepare my decorations and was gutted. The roof in the garage had a leak right above where I stored my supplies. Everything was ruined. My hopes of winning back my crown were dashed in a heartbeat. For a minute, I thought that maybe this was the best. I had spent a lot of spare time planning for this, and I had a honeydew list that was growing by leaps and bounds. Maybe I was too into the competition. This was probably healthy. I was planning on telling my family that we'd do a simple display this year, but then my kids spent the night at their friend's house and my wife worked late. I was alone, had the entire internet to help solve my problem, and I decided as a last-ditch effort to see what cheap supplies I could find online. If there was nothing, I'd throw in the towel. That's when I saw an ad on Craigslist that caught my attention. Can't keep these things anymore. Halloween. I was weird enough to warrant a click, and I'm glad I did. Inside, someone was getting rid of years' worth of Halloween decorations. I called right away, and I told them that I'd be there in 10 minutes to pick it up. The house was a bit off the beaten path, but nothing too crazy. The owner, on the other hand, tiptoed into Nutsoville. She said her name was Shade, which, whatever, it's a Craigslist buy, and that she was going to be moving soon. There wasn't any moving boxes or anything. I didn't know if she had been honest, but I didn't care. She told me that she had held on to these things for as long as she had to, but she had to get rid of them now. There were several trunks. I had hit the mother lode. I pulled out my wallet and she stopped me. She said I could have them for free. I asked to see what was inside, but she really didn't want me opening them there. She said they were so tightly packed, it might cause a mess. I wanted to make sure I wasn't inheriting someone's junk, so I insisted. She sighed and ducked back into the house. When she returned, I noticed that she had put on a handsome necklace. I asked about it, but she either didn't hear me or ignored me. It's probably some Etsy thing, so I just let it slide and I cracked open the first trunk. There were bones. Not a complete skeleton, but odds and ends. Some cloaks, cauldrons, headstones. It was incredible. They were high quality stuff, too. I asked if she wanted anything for them, and she said no. I shrugged, loaded them into my truck, and thanked her for the supplies. She muttered something under her breath, and then slammed the front door. I wanted to get far away from Shade as possible, so I bolted home. When I got there, I dragged everything into the garage, and I unloaded everything. It was better than I could have ever hoped for. There were at least 5 full skeletons, 2 witch hats, a few brooms, lanterns, vials with red and blue and green water in them, and so much more. I sketched out the design I wanted for the yard and was so pleased with myself, I might not have the animatronics I wanted, but these looked so good, I might not need it. I started setting up the yard when my wife got home with the kids. They were jazzed about the props, but my wife was confused. I told her that all my old supplies got ruined in the storm, and that I'd gotten all these for free online. I told her it was kismet. She was dumbfounded. I swore that I hadn't spent a dime on one, save for the cost of gas to go pick them up, and as an added bonus, we got 5 new steamer trunks for free. They could be antiques. We could sell them. She was put off by the whole thing. They looked too real. It kind of made her sick to her stomach. Something about all of this was off to her, and I assured her it was nothing. I thought if I showed her the trunks, she might come around, but she didn't. She was looking over them and agreed that they were old, but they made her feel worse. Along the side of the trunks, she noticed something carved into the wood. It was a cross inside a circle, inside a triangle. I told her that it was probably just some kind of old identification thing. Maybe it was a hobo code from the 1930s. These trunks were that old. But she didn't want to hear it. She told me I could keep these for this year and then I would have to get rid of them. It was too much. Everyone would think that we robbed a crypt or something. I must have spent all day working on my scene. 2 skeleton witches raising the bodies of a few fallen comrades crawling out of the grave while 2 minions held lanterns because next thing I knew, the sun was gone and my porch light kicked on. I sat back and I admired the scene. It was good. It looked real. I grabbed a lighter and lit up all the lanterns. The orange gave the whole scene an eerie glow. Final touch. They placed those witch hats on the skeletons. Unsettling. I loved it. Before I was done, Tim came jogging by, he stopped and let out a whistle. He was impressed. He asked if he could get a closer look at the skeletons. I let him. Messed around with the bones and looked the skeletons up and down. Shook his head. Oh, these are amazing. Thanks, I said, beaming. Picked him up this morning. From where? I said, the magician doesn't reveal his secrets. Huh. Well, looks like I'll have to pull out all the stops, he said, nodding goodbye and continuing with his jog. As he ran, I muttered half-jokingly, so long, Nemesis. I went inside for a few beers, some TV, and a deep, satisfying sleep. It was about 3 in the morning when my daughter started screaming from across the house. I dashed up and I found her outside her bedroom door in tears. I asked what was wrong, and all she could say was that someone was looking in her window. I grabbed a bat and I went out the front door. There wasn't anyone there, but someone was looking into her window. It was one of the skeleton witches. I walked over to the decorations, and I looked down at the ground. There were footprints around the window. It looked like the skeleton had been dragged from where they had been. I figured neighborhood kids were playing a prank. Wouldn't be the first time they messed around and dragged the skeleton back to its spot. The next day when I went to work, I noticed that one of the skeletons that was on the ground seemed to have been moved around. Its bones were a bit scattered than before. And again, there were footprints, but nothing much else. I thought about getting security cameras, then I remembered how much they cost. It's just a temporary problem. In less than a month, this would be over. That night around midnight, I was sitting in my living room, half paying attention to whatever Netflix show I was watching and bullshitting around online. That's when I heard something outside moving around. I glanced up and nearly had a heart attack. Someone had put the witch skeleton in the living room window. After I collected myself, I listened and heard hushed whispering outside in the front yard. Kids are still there. I decided to repay the favor and scare the hell out of them. I went around to my back door and I snuck outside. It was colder than I thought. I could see my breath. I hadn't been cold inside. I tiptoed to the gate and quietly opened it. I walked softly along the side of my house, waiting to jump out and scare the kids. Right as I got to the edge of the house, I heard more hushed whispering. They were still there. I psyched myself up, then I jumped out of my hiding spot, screaming like a goddamn madman. One of the skeleton witches fell to the ground, and I heard what sounded like footsteps on pavement running on the opposite direction. Down the street, I saw figures running away, or so it seemed. I was pissed I didn't get a good view, and that they had come back a second time. I decided to call the cops. Naturally, when the cops showed up, they looked bored with my story. They said, absence of any kind of evidence, they couldn't do anything. They could increase patrols through the area, but that was about it. They looked at the footprints and agreed that somebody had been there, but they just hopped back into their squad car and rolled away. The next night we managed to make it through without any incidents. I started to think that maybe my impromptu scaring act had worked. But the following night I heard voices again from outside my window. They had come back. Instead of scaring, I called 911 and waited for the red and blue lights to come cruising by. When they finally did, 3 hours later, the kids had left. The same cops from the night before. They looked less than amused. They again assured me that they'd roll more cars nearby, but honestly, didn't expect to catch anyone. They suggested I considered moving the figure in at night, or maybe getting a motion detector for the front porch light before they left. At this point, my wife wanted me to just take down the decorations. They were unsettling her, the kids weren't exactly thrilled about them, and the idiots in the neighborhood kept messing with them. I heard her, but I was also pretty adamant that these were isolated incidents and they would die down when the rest of the neighborhood decorations went up. She told me fine, but I could tell she wasn't happy with me. I promised that if anything else happened, I would take them down. She said not only would I take them down, but I would get rid of them. I agreed. For the next few days, things were fine. Felt like I had vanquished the teens with the increased police presence. The decorations didn't move again. My kids warmed up to them, especially when I added some fun lights around them to lighten up the mood. And even my wife had to admit that things were better. About a week later, I went out in the morning for work and noticed that the strand of lights that I had decorated the skeletons with had been removed. They weren't gone exactly. Someone had tied them in a noose. I didn't tell anyone, I just grabbed it and tossed it in my car. That night, I decided to stay up late and make sure that no one was fucking with me. I'm not gonna lie, for a minute, I thought it was Tim. Maybe he was really intimidated by my design, but I pushed that away as being crazy. Our rivalry was fun. Not anything too serious. Tim was nice. He's been to my house. His wife had amazing lemon bars. I was just paranoid. Around 1 a.m, I heard footsteps coming down the sidewalk in front of my house. It sounded like someone was running, and the dull thwack ran in the night air. I thought it might be the kids returning to fuck with my things. I moved to the living room window and peered out into the darkness. It took a minute for my eyes to adjust to the dark, but when it did, I noticed that one of the witch skeletons was missing. The goddamn kids were back at it. I needed evidence this time, so I knew I was going to have to record them in the act. Show the local cops that I wasn't crazy. I walked out my back door as quietly as I could. I pulled out my cell phone. Like the other night, I wanted to sneak up on them. But unlike the other night, I didn't want to scream at them. I got to my gate and I slowly opened it. Then I nearly passed out. The witch skeleton was standing there. I fell back, dropped my phone on the concrete. I let out a little yell, but stifled it with my hands. For some reason, I expected the skeleton to move, but it just stood there. The empty eye sockets staring forward. I stood up, dusted myself off, slid past the skeleton. I hit record on my camera and prayed my scared yelp hadn't scared away the teens. When I got to the end of my house, I edged my phone around the corner and looked at the screen. I was expecting to see a few teens laughing and moving shit around. The camera lens struggled to focus, and when it did, I didn't see any teens. There was no laughing. There wasn't anything. All the decorations were gone. I walked out from behind the house confused. I stumbled over to the lawn. I saw footprints all over, but nothing else. Where the hell had everything gone? Just then I heard footsteps running away from where I had just come from. I ran around the house and stopped, stunned. The skeleton that was standing near my gate was gone too. I felt a chill go down my spine. Maybe just maybe this wasn't a neighborhood kid just fucking with me. I heard what sounded like a cackle coming from my front lawn, then saw orange in the reflection of my car's windshield. I walked back to my front yard and saw my lawn was on fire. Only it wasn't just a random blaze. It was by design. It was a cross inside a circle inside a triangle. Just like in the trunks. I grabbed my hose and was going to spray the fire out, but as quickly as it turned it on, the fire went out. I heard a faint cackle again. This time it sounded like it was on my roof. I didn't want to see if anything was there. I ran back out of the house and locked all the doors. I stayed up for hours. The following day, I was a wreck. I didn't want to scare my family. I told my wife that she was right. The decorations were weird, and I decided to take them all down last night. She was happy at first, but then she looked out the front window and frowned. Real funny, she said, flipping me off. I went to the window, I opened it wide, and they were all back in the same place as they had been. Except the 2 witches' skeleton skulls had been turned, one facing my front window, the other one looking off down the street. I felt a chill run down my body. All day at work, I couldn't shake what happened. I googled the cross inside a circle inside a triangle picture, but didn't find much at first. But 20 or so pages into the search, I found something that made my heart race. The webpage said the drawing was related to witchcraft. Specifically, it was a symbol often carved into the coffins of witches that had been burned at the stake. These symbols were old, like 1600s old. It was thought that the symbol kept the witches' remains from acting up again. If the coffins had been opened, the witches would be free to cause havoc. As long as they were sealed and marked, things were fine. But if they were released... My mouth went dry, I felt my eye twitching, my stomach was churning. I left work early, barely able to give my boss a reason for splitting at noon. I rushed home to my empty house. I wanted these things gone before my family was home. I grabbed the trunks and I dragged them to the front yard. I started disassembling the bones and throwing everything inside those trunks. I know it sounds crazy, but I could feel them staring at me as I tossed them back into the trunks. As soon as I finished packing up the last box into my truck, I saw Tim walking towards me. He had stayed home from work. He asked me what was going on. Well, the kids didn't like these. They're too scary. Decided to take them down. Oh, they were pretty realistic. Yeah. Plus the kids in the neighborhood were messing with them every night. Moving them around and shit. You know, don't want to have to deal with that anymore. Tim started laughing. That makes sense now, he said. Thought I saw one of those things walking down the street the other night. What? I came down for a glass of water. It looked like one of them was walking down the street. I was spooked to hell at first, but realized that was crazy. It's probably kids moving them around. I forced a smile, but I wanted to die. Yeah, they were giant assholes. I found them all over. I think I'm gonna wait until closer to Halloween to put my stuff out. I don't want you to look out and see a mad scientist strolling down the street at midnight. Forced to laugh. Yeah. Well, if you don't want these, gotta take them off your hands. I really admire the craftsmanship. I wanted to win the decorating contest, but not that bad. I feigned a frown. Wish you'd asked me earlier. Buddy at work has taken them. Damn. Well, at least they're going to a good home. Yeah. I slammed the gate to my truck and I said goodbye. I drove down to Shade's house and not surprisingly, she had moved out. The place looked as sinister as it had before, worse now because it had been abandoned. Fuck it, she's getting these things back. I backed my truck into her driveway and went to go get rid of the trunks. When I opened the gate, I felt a pain in my stomach and my head start pounding. Normally I would have been laid out by the pain, but I fought through it and I quickly unloaded the trunks into Shade's empty driveway. I didn't care how they landed, only that they weren't near me. I thought I heard one of them crack when it hit the ground, but I didn't stick around to find out. I hopped back into my truck and I took off. As I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror and I swear I saw those skeleton witches standing in the driveway. Maybe I was seeing things. I didn't care. They were gone. They were out of my life. Things were fine the rest of the month. Halloween came and went. The Johnsons won the decorating contest again, and my family had an amazing time trick-or-treating. My wife was pleased the skeletons were gone. I just tried to forget that they were ever there. Things went back to normal. What's odd, though, is every so often, when I'm up late and the wind starts to howl, I swear to God, I hear cackling.
Rotting. The farm near our house had a jack-o'-lantern pumpkin patch on Halloween. It's pretty cool to look at. A whole field filled with meticulously carved pumpkins with their grotesque faces glowing from the candlelight within.
There was candy strewn about in little baggies, and kids of all ages visited either before or after they trick-or-treated to get some extra loot. We moved in across the street from that field a couple years ago. At first we loved the idea of the jack-o'-lantern patch. It looked quite haunting and really spoke to the Halloween spirit in me and my wife. But when Halloween was over, the farmer didn't take the jack-o'-lanterns away, he left them to rot. I assume it was to fertilize the ground for whatever crop he'd plant in the spring. It made sense, he wouldn't want all that organic material to go to waste. And the problem was, they'd attract animals. Animals and bugs. In the unseasonably warm November we had last year, the smell of the rotting gourds brought critters from far and wide to the field. When they were done eating, they'd wander to the neighbors. Being a small town, there was little anyone could do for the farmer, his name was Reuben, and doing what he wanted on his property. We had to deal with the deer and skunks and coyotes and foxes and flies and bees and bats and all eating and shitting and fucking their way across the town until no more pumpkins were left. And last year, I approached Reuben while he was setting up the jack-o'-lanterns. He was a friendly guy, there was never any doubting that. I explained the issue and he listened and he nodded. He said a few other people had told him the same thing, and he'd fix the fences over the summer so that wouldn't be a problem anymore. Besides, he told me with a smile, last year was just a test run. This Halloween, everything's gonna be just perfect. On Halloween, the jack-o'-lantern field looked even better than it had the year before, even though the arrangement was the same. Reuben had hired some artists to collaborate and create some truly monstrous designs for the pumpkins. They were awesome. I even did a walkthrough by myself in the early afternoon before the candles were lit, just to take it all in. Felt like a kid again. As the evening was coming to a close, and we'd given out the majority of all of our candy to the neighborhood children, we were getting ready to turn off the light and walk up when we heard sirens approaching. I looked outside and I saw a procession of police cars, fire engines, and ambulances, all of them heading towards us. I stepped out on the porch and I watched as they passed by our house, took that sharp left into the driveway of Reuben's farmhouse. I sat on the steps with my wife and watched as the lights were flipped on and the field was partially illuminated. "Oh my God," I whispered. In the harsh overhead lights, I saw bodies on the ground. Among the glowing jack-o'-lanterns, small ones, small, costume ones. Kids. "Oh my God," I repeated louder. Paramedics and rescue officials descended on the field and worked to resuscitate the still bodies. One by one, they gave up. Parents were arriving in droves, and the sound of wailing and hysteria filled the air. My wife and I held one another as little bodies with sheets over them were loaded into ambulances. The next morning it was all over the news. 32 children died in an apparent poisoning. Reuben was arrested and questioned. He refused to speak to the investigators. He was held without bail. Funerals were held. The pumpkins began to rot. It was another unreasonably warm November, and on cue, insects began to discover the field. Clouds of flies drifted in and out, blanketing the field in a gray haze as they left their eggs in the pumpkin's softening flesh. In the following days, toxicology reports on the autopsy children came back. Whatever had poisoned them was still unknown. They'd exhibited all the outward signs of a poisoning. Cyanosis, hemorrhage, paralysis, etc., but no toxins were found in their bodies. Tissue samples were held for further testing, but the corpses were released to the families. And 2 weeks later, the air was still thick with flies and bees. We hadn't had a frost, and things that crawled and flew feasted on the pulpy remains of the jack-o'-lanterns. From the house, I could see their deformed, hideous faces which no longer evoked a feeling of holiday fun. They were faces that mocked the dead. The incredibly warm autumn continued, 20 degrees above average, according to the weatherman. Flowers were blooming. Cherry trees had blossoms at full 5 months ahead of time. Pumpkins were still there, but mostly formless, having succumbed to the rot and ravenousness of vermin. As the hot November slouched into December, the luckiest of us
had started to forget about the tragedy that had befallen the town, but we still got reminders, especially on December 2nd, when Ruben broke his silence. My cousin Ron works for the police department as a mechanic. Doesn't have any access to criminals or official information, but he talks to the cops a lot. The cops like to talk. Ron came over on the 2nd before any news had gotten out about what Ruben was saying. It was clear he was uncomfortable. Lillian and I sat and listened while Ron relayed what his buddy had learned from the detective. The Ruben I knew was nothing like the man being described by my cousin. He'd blanketed himself with cuts and scars, indecipherable symbols and words. Every inch of his flesh was carved and mutilated in one way or another, something he'd done with his fingernails over the course of time that he was in jail. The detectives learned that Ruben was ready to talk when he began to scream the names of each dead child. Or just after midnight on the 2nd, he shouted each first, middle, and last name until his voice was hoarse. Detectives stood on the other side of his cell and transcribed what he said. I didn't understand most of it. It was better than nothing. The main takeaway was a date and time, December 5th, 11 p.m. No one could figure out what he meant by it, so there was a lot of speculation. All the police could do was park a unit over by the farm overnight just in case he had something planned on the 5th. And on that day, I sat with Lillian and Ron on the front porch and stared at that black field in front of us. 11 came. Nothing happened. We waited for a few minutes. I saw the cop across the street standing next to his car, smoking a cigarette. As we were getting ready to go inside, I saw something flickering in that field. A tiny flame. "Look," I told the others and I pointed. They saw it too. More flickers came into view. "Hey!" I yelled at the cop. He kept pointing at the field. The cop snuffed out his cigarette and walked around the barn to take a good look. Got to the side of the field and then raised his radio to call for backup. As we watched, the flickers intensified as if they were from new candles. They'd finally started properly burning their wicks after sputtering and threatening to go out, and after a couple of minutes, more police cars arrived. I got up. I started to cross the street. I needed to see what was going on. "Don't," said Lillian. And she grabbed my hand, but I shrugged her off and I headed towards that fence. I heard Ron walking behind me. The police arrived to lit up the field with their searchlights. We could see the rotten pumpkins sitting in that field, all with single candles sticking out of them. They were shaking one by one. Candles fell and hit the dry straw. The straw ignited. The police officers called for emergency assistance from the fire department. There was no chance that they'd get there in time. The fire began to rage. Entombed in flame, the rotten pumpkins started to burst. Only after their pulpy bodies had disintegrated did they see what was inside. Oh my God. Ron half whispered, half prayed. In the place of each pumpkin, there was a small, human-shaped thing sitting with its head down and its knees clutched to his chest. The heat intensified further, and I backed up, but I still saw it all. One by one, the things rose on sturdy legs, and they stood erect. They were growing, and soon they reached the size of the children who died. Their skin began to char. They walked out of the flames towards the crowd of police officers without any idea what to do, but terrified out of their minds, some began to shoot. The bullets didn't stop them. Round after round tore through the fire-spawned children, exiting their backs and legs and heads in a geyser of gore, but they walked ever forward. Soon the officers who'd fired fell to the ground. They didn't move for a second, but they just started to rot, just like the pumpkins. Other officers backed away. I backed away all the way up to my house. I watched from that doorway with my wife and my cousin. We were horrified. A procession of children walked down the street, followed by the police cars. Firefighters worked to put out that blazing field, and after a little while, it succeeded. Ron turned on his police scanner. We sat in the living room, listening with horror as news of dead cops and other officials came in. "The children have reached the prison. The children have burned through the cell of Ruben Rendell.
The children are carrying Rendell back the way they came. Fuck, I said, then opened the front door. They were coming back down the street, a procession of blackened, smoldering kids carrying a burning man, Reuben, and he was screaming, "It's almost done! It's almost finished!" He screamed with peals of hysterical laughter as he burned. The children carried him to the field and placed him in the center, and they placed themselves in that same spot as the pumpkins from which they'd emerged. Most had gone out, but some still glowed with dull red fire, and before Reuben burned to death, he unleashed one final scream. "Please accept this offering! Is this enough? Is this what you needed? See me through! See me through!" There were no sounds from him after that final word. Nothing but the crackling of dying flame. The following days were a whirlwind of investigations, media visits, and speculation. No one knew what happened. No one knew what Reuben had done, and for a while, it was still a mystery how the kids had been poisoned in the first place. A mystery, that is, until Jasmine McCrae, the mother of a child who was fortunate enough to have been too sick to trick-or-treat, found a small letter in her son's toy chest. It read, "For a special night of Halloween fun, draw this little picture on a piece of paper and swallow it. Then come to Farmer Reuben's pumpkin patch to trick or treat. You'll never, ever want to leave." The picture was of an inverted star, a pentagram. Jasmine's son told her Reuben had given them to kids at recess one day after he talked to the classes about what it was like to be a farmer. He came to them individually and made them promise to throw it away after they read it and not tell their parents. Jasmine gave the letter to the police and then told the media, while the superstitious residents of the town took that as an answer to what had happened. Skeptics like myself couldn't believe it. Even after what I'd seen, I couldn't believe that something supernatural had occurred. But then the photographs came in. The aerial photographs from the news helicopters the day after the Holocaust at the field. Clearly marked in carbon and ash were the shape of a pentagram, the exact shape the pumpkins had been arranged in. No one had noticed it from the ground. And at the center of that pentagram, where Reuben had screamed his final pleading prayer, 4 words were burnt into the dirt. The answer to the old farmer's prayers. Not enough. Never enough. When I was 12 years old, I was gearing up for an awesome Halloween out with my friends. At the time, it was still relatively safe for kids to go combing neighborhoods in search of candy and treats without a lot of parental supervision. Times have been certainly changed now, but after this incident, I'm not sure I'd ever want my kids out alone at night, especially on Halloween. Cedar Mill Road was long and scattered with a lot of houses. It was an area that was kind of known to be spooky, mainly because there was a lot of old houses at the end which had lots of swirling ghost stories. Now, I had heard many childhood whispers and legends. It was an apple orchard years ago, and slaves had been brutally murdered. The original owner had hung himself at the top of the staircase. There were so many stories, but all the town's kids were enamored by the house. We would ride bikes by the house in hopes of catching a glimpse into its history. We were all certain that it was filled with all sorts of paranormal delights. After trick-or-treating for several hours and almost reaching the end of Cedar Mill Road, a friend suggested that we go knock on the door of the house to see if anyone answered. We knew an old woman lived there by the last name of Murphy. No one ever saw her much. She had inherited the property and had lived there for probably 50 years. It was a big house, especially for one person. I always thought that it had been lonely. be unmarried. No children and living in such a big old rundown house. My dad called it decayed gentry, although I had no idea what that meant. The driveway winded up through the orchard, which lay sprawled out in front of the house, and no one tended to the apples anymore, so most of them lay rotting on the ground, which by October was more of a rotting stench than an apple fragrance. "Hey, you go ring the bell," Jessica told me. I shrugged. "I'm not going by myself." "Take Olivia with you," she said. Olivia shook her head. I don't think so. It's getting late. I need to go home." Jessica grabbed her hand. "We'll all go together. It smells bad," Olivia said. "I don't want to go up there." I agreed. "Yeah, the apples stink. If any old woman lives here, she might already be in bed. She probably doesn't want trick-or-treaters." "She doesn't even have a front porch light on," Olivia said. "Universal signs for leave me alone." "You guys are such chickens. Come on, it's Halloween. Let's just go do this, and then we'll go to school on Monday and tell everyone what happened. We'll be the coolest kids in class." But much to my dismay, we were being led further up the dark gravel driveway to the dilapidated mansion at the top of the hill. Olivia had some neon glow stick bracelets, which was the only light that we were able to see with, because it was pitch black and we didn't have any flashlights. It had been a fairly cloudy night, although it was almost a full moon. We had only glimpses of moonlight the entire night. None of us thought ahead to bring any sources of light. We were reaching the top of the hill where the house was positioned. I got a chill. I was shaking. I didn't know if it was the temperature outside or the fact that I was frightened, but my teeth were slightly chattering. The three of us approached the house and climbed onto the porch. Jessica pushed me forward. "Ring the doorbell," she was whispering. "I don't want to ring the bell," I said. She pushed me again. "Just do it!" I stepped forward. My eyes had begun to adjust to the darkness, and I could see the door in front of me with elaborate stained glass. Although my hand was shaking, I reached for the bell. I pressed it. Immediately, Jessica and Olivia started giggling and screaming. They took off running, leaving me standing on the porch. I heard a noise from inside the house. I darted off the porch. I tripped over my costume and fell face first into the grass. My pumpkin-shaped bucket filled with candy spilled onto the ground, but I was too scared to bother with it. I threw the bucket down, trying to see my way to the drive, but it was dark. I could hear the girls giggling in the distance somewhere ahead of me. "Those bitches," I murmured. My feet hit the gravel on the road. My heart was pounding. Why was I so scared? I was on the road now and away from the house. I was in a safe place. The old woman was probably in bed. She hadn't even opened the front door. I told myself not to be afraid. I was fine now. We were just being dumb kids. I had slowed from a sprint. I was breathing heavily but slowly down to a walk. I could make out headlights down the cedar mill, so I knew that I was not far from the road. Those girls would be waiting down there at the end for me. I'd give them a piece of my mind. "Shit," I said in a low voice. "The stupid girls." And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, two hands grabbed at my chest from behind. Something was pulling me. I let out a scream. Something had me. I could hear it snarling and hissing as it pulled me. I tried fighting it off. It was dragging me over into the side of the driveway. I could see the outline of an apple tree in the moonlight. I could smell the rotting stench. I was 12, but I was fighting as hard as I could. I was screaming and yelling, "Help me!" I tried to hit the arms off of me. I was combative as possible. Whoever had me was not letting go. I felt sharp nails digging into my chest while it was pulling me towards the apple trees. "Who are you? Let me go!" The clouds must be moving away from the moon, because for a moment, again, the moonlight was shining down, illuminating the orchard around me, and that's when I caught a glimpse. What had its arms around me was an old hag, a woman, but she was old and looked half dead. She had flesh that looked like it was rotting away from her face. She was still gurgling and snarling. I managed to twist myself loose, and the second I did, I felt her sharp nails on my back. But I took off running. I ran through the orchard, dodging trees. I felt the disintegrating apples squishing and oozing under my feet. At one point, I slipped and fell into a pile of the mush. I finally made my way to the gravel and didn't stop until I was at the main road. Of course, my asshole friends were posting up waiting for me, but the minute they saw me bolting, they did not laugh. I was in shock. Somehow we managed to get to a neighbor's house when the person called my parents to come pick me up. My friends explained what had happened and how they'd left me at the house. I had scratch marks on both my chest, my back from the incident. My parents decided that we needed to call the police to make a report, and the police thought that it was probably just a Halloween prank, because it was probably just some teenagers trying to scare me. We ended up getting a huge lecture from the cop and our parents. The next day was a Sunday. I was still really terrified about what had happened, and was adamant that it was not just some teenage kid messing with us. I kept telling my parents over and over that it was someone else. Parents finally told me that it was enough and over with, and we didn't need to rehash it. By early evening, I was settled into being a bit calmer about that whole thing when the phone rang. My dad answered, and after a few minutes of "yes, I see," and "I understand," he came into the den where I was piling up, watching some television. My mom was sitting in her chair reading a book. She looked up at my dad, who was kind of pale. "What is it, George?" she asked. He looked at us both in astonishment. He said, "That was Deputy Richards from last night. He went over to do a welfare check on Miss Murphy after they couldn't reach her last night for questioning. Turns out Miss Murphy was dead inside her house the whole time. Apparently the coroner said he estimates roughly that she probably died back in August. He said they still have no signs of anyone else being in the house last night. The house wasn't broken into or anything. The only thing they found outside was your bucket of candy, which was all over the ground, just like you said." "Didn't you say it was an old woman who grabbed you?" The dog won't shut up. He's been out front barking his head off in the yard. All the neighbors' dogs are going wild like this for days. I've been having terrible trouble keeping the kids away from the door as well. They don't understand why we can't go outside, why they can't go trick-or-treating tonight. I feel like our dog barking out in the yard alone might not have been enough to make me feel so fearful. Maybe I wouldn't have lost it, even with all the dogs in the whole block going wild. Let's acknowledge that possibility for a moment. The idea that I might have been able to deal with it. When I saw what happened to Taylor Roberts, my neighbor across the street, that was more than enough to stay inside. He went out to try to calm down his own dog. Seemed almost excited at the idea of doing it, but that changed very quickly. I watched it rip him open. Took him down with a bite to the Achilles tendon. Even from across the street, I could see the tendon snap and spring back into his calf like a dark rubber band. And the dog was on him, driving its snout into his stomach, tearing into his intestines. It ripped them out and dragged them across the yard by them like they were bundles of knotted up ropes. The dog shook his head wildly. Its mottled and matted fur became spattered further like a Jackson Pollock painting. Gray, furry background with a fresh splatter of dark crimson. Matthew comes slowly back downstairs and I sigh. "What if we just go out the back door, Dad? We can still make trick-or-treating then, right? And then we'll be safe." "Yes." He's been dressed in a skeleton costume since he woke up this morning. He's been crying for the past 3 hours. Every time the crying stops, I know he's come up with another way to try to convince me to change my mind. When I say no, he just starts crying again. "Damn it, Matthew. For the last time, we're staying inside," I said. I didn't mean to be so harsh, but this was the 5th time he asked since 11 this morning. He isn't listening. We aren't going trick-or-treating. We can't go out there. I don't know if we can ever go out there again. I can't stop looking through the blinds at the neighbors' dogs, barking wildly. Some have cats pawing at the door and mewing to be let inside, scratching with disjointed and broken limbs, begging for their milk. I understand why Taylor was so excited to see his dog come home. Baxter only ran away last week. They never could find him. He was, at long last, finally home. Looks like a car drove over Baxter. His skull's collapsed. At least one of his legs is broken. I want to get away from the windows, stop staring, but it's too unnerving. I have to look. It's like watching a train wreck. I can't stop looking at my own dog. His fur is gone in patches. His eyes are gray and cloudy. He stares back at me inside, snarling, barking his head off. He's caked from snout to tail in mud. What looks like blood. Julie looks out the window next to the door. "Daddy, it's Rocket," Julie says. "He must have found his way all the way back from the farm he moved to. Can we just bring him in?" Of course, that's what I told him. I couldn't tell him Rocket was very sick. How do you explain euthanasia to a 4 or 6-year-old? Even if I could explain about Rocket, how am I going to explain to them how every dead pet on the block has come back? I can't even explain it to myself. "No," I said, a bit more calmly. "For the last time, get away from the door." When I was 10, my mother searched through my Halloween candy for the first time, although she didn't say why. I'd snuck downstairs to hear the late night news. I knew she was looking for needles, razor blades, and poison, like Ouija boards, haunted houses, crocodiles in the sewer, and the satanic messages on rock records. I thought the dangers of Halloween were probably just urban legends, but I couldn't be sure. I was having a sleepover with my best friend Chris, Sammy, and David that year. The late October sun was as fat and orange as a pumpkin when it disappeared beneath the smoky horizon, and we headed out to trick-or-treat. Chris was a vampire, Sammy was a werewolf, David was a zombie, and I was the clown from It. At the end of the night, some older kids in masks tried to steal our pillowcases full of candy. One of them had a hatchet, and its edge glittered in the suburban streetlight. We made eye contact with each other and silently nodded. When Chris gave the signal, each of us took off running in a different direction. We met up on my porch, panting, exhausted, and more than a little spooked. We just wanted to get inside, lock the door, and scare ourselves silly with movies that didn't feel quite as frightening as a real teenager with a real axe. I almost didn't notice the little gift bag tied with orange and black ribbon that sat on our doorstep. I picked it up, curious. I was still holding it when we stepped inside and were confronted by my angry mother. "Do you four have any idea what time it is?" she huffed. "Candy on the counter, now!" We all made a big show of moaning, but the truth was, we were all happy to be in a bright, warm house with adults around. That little one, too. I'd almost forgotten about what I was holding. I dumped the contents onto the table. 5 pieces of candy in plain black wrappers, a toy of a hooded figure holding a bloody butcher's knife, an antique watch stopped at 1:13 a.m., and a Viewmaster plastic binoculars with click-to-view slides within. My mother carefully examined each piece of candy to ensure that it was factory-wrapped and free of needle jabs. "Can we have our candy back, please?" I groaned. "Nope," my father winked as he passed by on his well-traveled route from his office to his armchair. "Because I'm going to eat it all." He snagged one of the strange black candies, unwrapped it, and popped it into his mouth. He didn't make it 5 steps before the wrapper fell from his hands. My father grasped his throat as his face turned purple. "Honey? Honey, you all right?" My mother sprung to her feet as horrified choking sounds gurgled up my father's throat. As my mother reached him, the noises stopped. "Yep, it's definitely poison," my father laughed. My mother punched him in the arm. He was still snickering when he walked upstairs. Before long, my parents were completing their nighttime rituals while Chris, Sammy, David, and I rode a sugar high. My friends never got tired of bad movies and cheesy special effects, but I soon left the blue glow of the screen behind to wander through the dark and silent house. Not exactly sure what I was looking for. I stepped on the wrapper my father had dropped earlier. The outside was completely black, but the foil inside featured a single printed word. Am. I shrugged and opened another piece of candy as I fiddled with the knife-wielding toy figure. This wrapper said, "Get." Were they supposed to make a word if I put them together? Get-am? Or am-get? Didn't make any sense. I went back to the basement where my friends laughed in beanbag chairs and tossed popcorn at each other. They yelled at me when I turned on the table lamp, but I was focused. I put my eyes up to the Viewmaster lenses. "Spookomatic," read the first slide. A cute white ghost cartoon floated between the words. Click. The cornfield surrounded by forest. Blackbirds peck at a scarecrow hanging from a lonely post. The scarecrow is backlit by a cloudy sky, but its stitched-together gray skin looks incredibly lifelike. Click. An abandoned farmhouse in a rain-soaked field. The broken doorway is like an empty mouth. The smears of mud on the porch suggest that several heavy things have recently been drugged inside. Click. Some candlelit pumpkins on a porch. I get a strange feeling that I've seen these carven faces before. The street in the background seems familiar as well. Click. A loud crash interrupted my viewing. Sammy was wrestling with Chris, who was bragging that he knew an inescapable wrestling hold. David booed and threw popcorn, while I warned them to keep the noise down. Giggling at our own pathetic efforts to be quiet, we pushed the furniture up against the walls, tried to pin each other with moves we'd seen on TV. until we were sweaty, exhausted, and mad at each other. Still not ready for sleep, we put A Nightmare on Elm Street on in the background and prepared for a serious game of Truth or Dare. The gallons of Mountain Dew we'd been drinking had their predictable effect, and soon enough, Chris was scrambling upstairs to use the bathroom. On his way back down, he grabbed us each a few handfuls of candy. I noticed he was chomping on one of the strange black toffees. "What's the line inside the wrapper?" He frowned. "Huh?" Chris picked up the Scoop-O-Matic and gasped. "Dude, it's your house!" I grappled the device away from Chris. He wasn't kidding. The most recent slide looked like a blurry photo of my family home. Maybe taken from the woods in the backyard. The tiny black figures inside the twilight windows could easily have been my parents and I just a few days earlier. The others pushed and shoved to get a look as well, and accidentally clicked forward. A boy sleeps. A dimly lit second-story bedroom. I recognized the Terminator poster on the wall, the model planes hanging from the ceiling, and the books scattered on the old school desk because the room is mine. And the boy is me. I hurled the Spook-O-Matic at the wall as though it might bite me. David, who hadn't been paying much attention to the commotion we were making, cleared his throat. Guys? He held up the black toffee wrapper. Ready was written on the silver foil. I rifled through the pile of candy until I found the final black toffee and tore it open. Coming, it read. Heart pounding, I put the wrappers in order and discovered that Chris's line was really an I. Get ready, they whispered aloud. I am coming. Ooh, spooky. David rolled his eyes. I mean, I guess it's a good prank, though. The watch. I shook Sammy. What time did it say on the watch? Sammy couldn't remember. The clock read 1:11 a.m. I was hurrying to the kitchen to find the last piece of the puzzle when I heard movement on the back porch. I pressed my back against the couch and tried to stop my heavy breathing. Something scraped against the glass door. I kicked on the patio light, bathing the porch in white radiance. The hooded figure in the pale mannequin mask was identical to the tiny toy sitting on the counter. 1:13, read the watch, and the digital clock on the microwave. The figure outside cocked its head at me, then grabbed the brick and smashed through the glass door. I ran downstairs screaming. I heard commotion in my parents' room, but I wasn't even thinking about them. My animal brain screamed only two messages: run and hide. Upstairs, I heard the sound of our family's treasured possessions being thrown, hacked apart and shattered. Adult footsteps charging down the stairs as my friends scrambled to disappear behind doors or under furniture. It was pathetic. In the cramped basement, there was nowhere to hide. The hooded masked figure kicked the TV screen, plunged the room into darkness. As we choked back tears and held our breath, we could feel the figure stalking around the room, throwing furniture and laughing. That laughter in the dark continued until police sirens sounded in the distance. And my father finally kicked down the door to the basement, which the intruder had propped shut using a chair. Slash marks covered the walls and furniture. Shattered dishware and picture frames covered the floor. The intruder escaped through an unused air vent at the back of our basement crawl space. The police later said that our attacker might have come and gone from the house any number of times before via the same route. Somehow, however, my family and friends were alive, unharmed. Physically, anyway. Psychologically. Some of us for life. I normally don't try to dredge up these memories from the past, but it's hard not to fear for my own children around Halloween. This year, they finally twisted my arm. I let them go trick-or-treating. I insisted that their mother go with them, armed, and that they were in public, so I'm not too concerned about that part of the evening. What bothers me is a little bag I found on my porch, tied with a black and orange ribbon. I've just finished opening it, unwrapping the black toffees inside and laying out their message. Ready for round 2. So recently my friend Jen has been staying with me overnight. Her mom works a double shift and dad isn't in the picture, so Jen texted me one night out of insomnia and asked if she could come over. But once I got approval from my folks, we've been spending almost every night up talking and getting to know each other all over again. It feels like ages since we hung out, really. Thanks to lockdown and virtual school and all that. Anyway, since it's spooky season, Jen suggested that we start watching scary stuff every night. We're both into that jump scare crap, and I figured, what the hell, you know? We didn't really have much else to do. A few nights ago, we watched John Carpenter's The Thing. Not the new one, the original. And it got us feeling nostalgic about other stuff that we grew up on that we weren't, as scared of anymore. Or that still scared us. The Old Nightmare on Elm Street was so cheesy. That movie hasn't aged well, she said. Well, Chucky used to give me nightmares, I offered, giggling at the silliness of a possessed doll, probably because I used to be obsessed with dolls. It's just ridiculous, isn't it? I told her. Jen laughed back and answered, it's not that bad. I mean, I used to think Mr. Bad Bones was pretty freaky. I wiped away a tear from my last laugh and mumbled, Mr. who? Bad Bones? What kind of fucky name is that? Jen rolled her eyes and said, from that show, Halloween Time? And now I was sure she was pulling my leg. It didn't sound familiar at all. She got a stern face and remarked, don't tell me you've never heard of it. Nope. But then my folks sheltered me a lot. No R-rated stuff. They were super helicopter parents, I remarked. Jen shook her head and went to grab her phone. No, this was a Saturday morning cartoon. Came out in the 90s, always came on usually after Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles or Pokemon. It was Channel 46, she said, and scrolled through her photos. Here's a drawing I did of him once, she said, pausing on the picture and showing it to me. Mr. Badbones lived up to his name. In Jen's drawing, he was a tall, lanky, humanoid-looking skeletal figure with 4 spidery arms and backwards legs like a bird. His face was a mixture between a human skull and what looked like an ox, I think. And his entire body, if you could call it that, since all you could see were his bones, were painted the darkest black I'd ever seen. Strangely enough, he didn't have eyes or a nose like a normal skull, just a misshapen mouth with incisors going through the back of his head. Like the teeth that gouged out his eyes or something. Freaky, I agreed, a bit surprised by how bizarre and hellish he looked. And you said this was a Saturday morning cartoon? I asked. Yeah. I don't think it ran for very long, but it was so memorable. There were these 2 little animated kids that always dressed up in costume in the show too. Jack and Jill, I think. Every week their costumes changed, and you never knew which one was which because you never saw their faces. They were supposed to teach kids about not being afraid, I think. She continued to tell me more about the show, and it sounded pretty cool to be honest, but also a little disturbing. One episode, their dog died, and they had to bury it. I remember that being super sad, but then they made a deal with Mr. Badbones, and it came back, she said, looking visibly frightened by the memory. I crossed my arms, and then reached over to grab my tablet. Okay, you're making this up. I think I would remember a show like that. I watched all the 90s cartoons, I said, going to YouTube and typing in Halloween Time. Like I suspected, nothing related to what Jen was talking about popped up. It wasn't a big deal like Transformers or something. Like I said, hardly anyone remembers it, Jen said, with a shrug as she scratched the back of her neck uncomfortably. Was she lying? Was she bothered by this? Something didn't feel right. Okay, sure. But Google isn't showing anything either. You're telling me you're the only person in the world who remembers this weird-ass show? I chuckled nervously and showed her my screen. Jen snatched the iPad from my hands, looking surprised by the fact that it wasn't there. Her face was a mix of confusion and what I thought was dread. At first, I thought she was pulling my leg. This is like one of those creepypastas, isn't it? You trying to scare me? I asked. No, this is real. I swear I watched the show when I was little, Jen said, scrolling through page after page of other options. But no show ever popped up. This doesn't make any sense, she admitted. as she frantically tried to find it. I could tell that Jen was bothered, or possibly even disturbed by all this. I mean, hey, what's wrong with you? I said, trying to take my phone back. Hey, I'm not making this up, she snapped. I never said you were. But this is going a little too far. Calm down. She looked up at me apologetically. Her eyes seemed desperate for answers, but I had no idea what was really bothering her about this. Hey, look, let's just play Xbox or something, I suggested. She agreed to it, thankfully, despite how tense she was, and I figured a good distraction to keep her mind off things. Finally, it was time to go to bed, and she hopped up to change. Sorry. You know, about earlier, she said as she brushed her teeth. I shrugged. It's fine. I'm sure there's a logical explanation, and we can figure that out tomorrow, I told her. She nodded. We both got into our beds. But I couldn't sleep. Despite the fact that Jen had been calmed down, it still bothered me how serious she was taking this cartoon. Why was it she insisted it existed? And a part of me wondered if there might be any truth to her claims. Lost media was hard to come by, and if it really affected her so much she wanted to prove it, to the point of going a little stir-crazy, that made me wonder what was this show all about. So once she had gone to sleep, I slipped over to my laptop and did a Tor search. It would have a wider, deeper range than just the regular internet, I figured. I typed in the name Halloween Time and got nothing. Then I tried Mr. Badbones and brought up some rather strange, disgusting Rule 34 art that made me want to vomit. I think I almost shut the computer off. Then I noticed that the art was all done by the same person. And maybe whoever was doing this weird art knew something about the show. I figured reaching out to this perv was the worst idea imaginable. After all, the art looked like they were glorifying all kinds of lewd acts, along with making Mr. Badbones look like he was a demonic sadist. But I was also worried about Jen. I needed her to at least see that she wasn't crazy about the show, I thought. So I emailed them a quick little question about doing a commission for the artwork. Short and sweet. I used a burner account so that whoever the sicko was wouldn't come find me. I clicked send. I heard a little chime behind me. It made me freeze in my chair. I slowly turned around to where Jen was fast asleep and saw the notification on her phone. It was like a beacon in the midst of a foggy sea. Instinctively, I pulled her phone out of the plug and checked the notification. It was the email I just sent online. She was the artist. I felt internally sick as I slid open her phone using the passcode I had seen her do 1,000 times. Then I went to her photos. There was an entire album full of more drawings, some far, far worse than what I had seen online. I kept looking, seeing all the different dark ways she was obsessed with this character. I kept scrolling towards the bottom and saw Mr. Badbones performing gory murders, slaughters. The latest drawing was one from just a few days ago. The eponymous character was standing over a cartoonish corpse. One that looked a little like me. What do you think? I jumped and dropped the phone. Jen was staring at me. Her bloodshot eyes as creepy as could be. Those are, those are some awesome sketches, Jen, I said nervously. I wasn't sure what she thought I'd seen. She picked up the phone slowly, still staring at me as she did. I just remembered something about this show, she muttered sleepily. I felt like I was sitting on pins and needles. What's that? The main characters all die in the end, she said nonchalantly. I swear, you couldn't hear a peep in that cold room as she closed up her phone. Maybe tomorrow we could try to watch an episode, she suggested. Sure. If we can find one. I said, not keeping my eyes off her. I'm sure we will. Jem said with a smirk and closed her eyes, back to sleep. That was a few hours ago. I'm pretty sure she's out for the night, but I'm extremely disturbed and scared by all of this. I don't want to think about the worst case scenario and believe that my friend might be a sociopath. And that's why I'm here, I guess. I'm scared out of my mind. I need some clarity about this fucking show. Was it real or not? Until I get some answers. I'm sleeping in the other room, with the door locked. Local clinic burns to the ground under mysterious circumstances. Miracle Clinic, a psychiatric unit just outside of town, was torched to the ground last night when one of the doctors set fire to themselves and to a mural in a patient's room, causing the east wing to go up in flames. When the first responders arrived and put the fire out, they took the doctor into custody, who insisted that he was trying to destroy the mural. He provided the following transcripts as the reason for his acts of arson. Patient file, RJ 47355. At approximately 3:30 this afternoon, the patient presented with symptoms of labored breathing, intense hallucinations, and severe self-inflicted injuries to the torso and legs. Patient was immediately given antibiotics and antipsychotics and placed in the behavioral unit until further diagnosis can be made. Note from Dr. Hanlon's journal, October 5th. I worked in behavioral and mental health for almost 30 years, so I feel like I've seen it all. That being said, I still want to treat every patient with the same care and respect that I would want if it was a member of my own family. I knew from the moment that the patient, henceforth referred to as Jane Doe until further notice, was troubled and experiencing severe PTSD based on what came with her. A police report that told the story of a massacre, one that she had survived. According to that report, Jane Doe was the sole survivor of a family of 4, with her sister and parents being brutally murdered. The official cause of death the medical examiner gave was decapitation. Police theorize that Jane Doe herself may in fact be responsible for these killings, seeing as there's no evidence of a break-in, nor anything found to suggest the family was a target. Once she recovered from the antipsychotics that we administered, I intended to have a full interview with her and discover as much of the truth as possible. October 6th. I wasn't able to speak to the patient yesterday. The medicine we gave her seemed to have had a calming effect. When she woke up, nurses found that she had been scribbling on the wall, a variety of different caricatures, all of which seemed to focus on the holiday of Halloween. Interview with Jane Doe. Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Gregory Hamlin. Can you tell me your name? Melody. Patient is fidgety and uncomfortable. Seems obsessed with continuing to draw. I couldn't help but notice the lovely artwork that you've been making. Can you tell me more about it? Patient's eyes appear bloodshot and dilating quickly, as though experiencing hallucinations. Halloween time. And what's that? Jack and Jill went up a hill to bury their dog, but didn't want him dead. So they made 2 more holes and went in the ground and stayed with him instead. Patient is saying this as she paces around the room, noticeably distracted by looking at 2 smaller cartoonish sketches in the wall, both of which were wearing ghost costumes. So, are those Jack and Jill? Can you tell me more about them? Dead now. Like all things should be. No need to be afraid. That's how we all are made. Again, the patient is acting erratically and starts to draw what looks like a large arching door. Melody, can you tell me more about this Halloween town? Time. It's just a show. Just to show that no one knows. They will. They'll make the nightmare real. She's sketching faster now, looking noticeably exhausted and confused, as though she isn't in control of her motions. What is that? What happened to your family? This seemed to disturb her even more. She paused, and she looked at me with troubled eyes. Dead now. All dead. Just like she said. All because of this! I had to call 2 orderlies in to sedate her. It took well over the recommended dosage to get her back to calm state, and after which we chose to have her strapped down and administer other tests. We also requested a blood sample to determine if she might be in our database. End of interview. October 6th, evening. Thanks to the sample I took, I had determined that the patient is a 17-year-old female from a local nearby community who was on her way to finishing up her school year earlier thanks to virtual classes. Nothing in the files from her high school or her PCP show any family history of mental illness. A review of her electronic devices was made by the police, however, and they found an unnamed file, which seems to solidify the theory that the patient harmed herself and the others of her family. Thanks to a colleague in the PD, it shows Melody and this other young girl both asleep in their room, both with the sound on. It sounds like one of them is singing, and reminds me of the strange jingle that Melody was humming to me as we talked. What's this all about? I decided to fast forward the video and see if anything happened. Around the midway mark, Melody is standing up, looking like she was in a daze of sleepwalking. It's difficult to see what is in her hand, but it looks like a pillow. To my shock and surprise, I watch as Melody smothers her friend to death. I could hear the screams as her friend writhed and tried to fight back, but this first girl was too strong. All the while, she kept singing that bizarre jingle over and over. Hey there, it's time for a scare. Won't you come with me today? Don't be afraid, we'll have a parade. All the livelong day. She said, over and over, as she held the pillow over her friend's face. Autopsy report confirms the girl died of asphyxiation. Then Melody turned around and went back to sleep as though nothing had happened at all. A few hours later in the video, she rose up again and began to scream bloody murder, shocked that her friend was dead. And then something turned the video off. I don't know for sure what, but it wasn't Melody, as she was too scared trying to resuscitate her friend. My initial thoughts in the video are that Melody entered into some type of hypnotic state that allowed her to act out on an impulsive behavior against her friend, and then later her parents. I have no idea what connection this has to her drawings, but I am insisting to the police that she remain here under observation until we can determine what is her current mental state. October 7th. Second interview with Melody Bradshaw. I'm sorry for the timing of this interview, but the police have asked that I ask some basic questions to determine your state of mind. Is that okay? Sure. Do you know where you are? Miracle Medical, I think. Yes, that's right. Do you know why you're here? Because of what I did. And what is that, Melody? Her lip twitched. Was it a smile or a quiver? Jennifer. She warned me. But I didn't understand. I still don't know what's happening, but this isn't just some kid's show. It's evil. It controls people. Melody stammered. She was looking towards the door as she drew in her wall. It's a very wide, large arched door, similar to how many artists have depicted the gates of hell. I can't help but to be drawn to it as well, given how much time she spent on it. I'm further fascinated by her insistence that killing her family wasn't what she wanted to do. Jennifer told me that there was one more episode of Halloween Time. I just didn't know I would be a part of it, she said, looking down at her shaking hand. I tried to press her further about what role her friend had in this entire bizarre story, and instead found that she was returning to a catatonic state. Unfortunately, it isn't the first time that I've seen patients attempt to push responsibilities over to another party, especially to a victim. I have to take what Melody has told me with a grain of salt. Still, part of me is disturbed by the things that I have seen and heard. Melody was not deranged before the incident, and instances of sudden madness do not happen often in the general public. My buddy at the PD has also told me that they did a check of the other girl's belongings and found no evidence to suggest Melody's theory, one that Jennifer was the cause of her sudden obsession with a cartoon show, one that doesn't exist. I can't help but to draw comparisons to a case in the northwestern U.S., and I'm afraid that I have little choice but to believe Melody is doing the same and using an insanity argument to avoid jail time. I'll be finishing up my report and handing it over to the authorities in the morning. October 8th. Police officers arrived this morning and escorted Melody to a holding facility upstate. However, upon entering her cell, we've discovered that the patient is missing. Furthermore, we've had discovered that the video file of that evening had been thoroughly scrubbed. No evidence of a break-in can be determined, and no trace evidence can be found to see where she could have left the padded room. Police are continuing an ongoing investigation. Dr. Henlon's internal notes. I returned to the room to get a better look at the sketches. Call me crazy, and disturbed as well, but I feel convinced that something was different about them now that Melody had disappeared. And I was right. I could see now that the drawing of the door was changed, altered somehow to show it unhinged, and it had a forced perspective of a hallway drawn within the cracked open door. My mind felt like I was going insane as a part of me considering the possibilities that somehow Melody had slipped into the walls and escaped that way. I instructed nurses not to bother the room for 24 hours so that we could document every drawing and try to compare them to any possible cold cases in the Tri-County area. When I returned home that evening, I couldn't help but to notice that I had an email in my inbox, straight from the patient herself, or rather, from the mysterious Halloween Time that she claimed to have been so fond of. I'll try my best to dissect what the video shows, and then send the evidence to the police. I can't help but be mortified, though, that this may be a message from beyond the grave. Children frighten me, and that's actually a good thing. You know, the fact of the matter is, kids these days no longer all right. There's something to be said about the sudden rise of specialists in the field of behavioral health in the age range of 5 to 10-year-olds. And you may find it odd to discover that my job of choice is that of a guidance counselor, even given what I just said. The reason for this is because I feel that even though a young mind is an enigma, it's pure, it's innocent. And that's all the more reason to help the young who have been particularly traumatized by the rage and darkness that haunts this world today. Beyond my general counseling, I also provide a service for the local DHS and Child Protective Services to help foster homes and shelters for wards of the state. Typically, there's only 3 reasons why a facility of this kind will call upon my services, and it's always because I'm their last resort. Number 1, a child has begun to act out violently and is in need of therapeutic treatment to alter the behavior. Number 2, a child has begun to act out in a manner non-typical of their age group or individual education plan. For example, a rambunctious child suddenly becomes silent, or a boisterous child choosing to remain calm. 3, a child's experiencing psychological problems relating to physical activity such as wetting the bed, sweating profusely without explanation, or night terrors. So last Thursday, I was called in on a case involving Owl Creek RTC, where 8 of the children in Ward B exhibited all 3 of the symptoms, and apparently it had gotten so bad they needed outside help. For all intents and purposes, Owl Creek is a place that really shouldn't have existed. Before it became a private orphanage, it was a boarding school. Before that, it was a hospital for developmentally disabled youths. In other words, it was a place where society sent children they could no longer handle themselves. Long, perfectly trimmed hedges and iron gates barred the ground from the outside world. A perfect utopia for these children to experience life unfettered from the abuse that likely shackled them in their whole lives. Here they could be free. Or at least, that was what it was meant to do. I recognized that those same protections could be perceived as a way to keep them unaware of life beyond these walls. The building itself was made of brick, long wooden trussels between slanted long glass windows. In every sense of the word, it resembled a fossil, a relic from a bygone era, and as I got closer to the front steps, I could still see the long scorch marks that had stained the stones during a fire that had likely occurred before I was even born. The entryway spread open into a more inviting atmosphere. A mixture of old and new architecture, distracting onlookers enough to make them feel comfortable. Besides myself and the front receptionist, the chamber was empty, void of any other warm welcome. Kenneth Avery, see Headmaster Rachel Browning? I told the short-statured blonde sitting behind the desk. She adjusted her Bluetooth headset, held up a bony finger before typing something out on her screen, then turning her full attention to me. She took my name again, and then paged the person in charge before making idle small talk. "How do you do it?" she asked me. Do what? "You've seen some of the worst things happen to the most innocent. How in the world do you keep going when time after time you come face to face with such despicable evil?" I opened my mouth to respond, but before I did, one of the larger wooden frame doors slammed shut, and a slim middle-aged woman approached us to greet me. "Dr. Avery, I'm so glad you can come on such short notice," she said, a faint smile passing her face. She looked worried, and I detected a lack of sleep in her voice. "Please, I don't have that title anymore. Just call me Avery, or Kenneth," I insisted, as she guided me away from the conversational desk clerk. "Sorry. I'm just so glad that you made it here. All the nurses are at our wits' end, to say the least," she explained, as she seemed to pick up the pace in the twisting corridors. "I'd like, if possible, to review the child's cases before I began evaluations," I told her. "I don't think that would be beneficial in this setting," she said softly, as we turned across a long, open courtyard to the secondary building, Ward B. "Did something happen?" I said. "You heard about the costumes, I assume?" "Yes, but I figured it was more than that. It's better if you come up with a fresh point of view, that's all," the headmaster answered. I couldn't argue with that logic, and there were too many times that a pre-existing opinion could stifle my observations. We made our way to the lounge where the nurses had gathered the 8 children for me to meet. All of them were different age, sex, and nationality. A regular bunch of kids, if I had ever seen one, playing with toys and puzzles as I entered the room. And also, all of them were wearing Halloween costumes. We've been trying to get them to cooperate to take them off, but the nurse trailed off as they shuffled their feet towards me inquisitively. All of them stopped a few feet away and stared up at me in unison. "Well, this is uncomfortable," I joked as the nurse shuffled past the group to greet us. Where did they get the costumes, anyway?" "That's the thing, we don't really know," she admitted weakly. That alone made me uneasy. "Mr. Avery, we made accommodations for you to stay at the administration building. How many days do you expect to remain?" she asked. "As long as it takes," I said firmly, as I focused on the children. Something was very wrong here. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to begin watching them as a group before I begin individual sessions. The two women showed themselves out. The children were still staring at me. I knew better than to show them the behavior made me uneasy, so instead, I slid a chair from the side of the room to the center of the circle. Once I had settled down, the 8 finally seemed to lose interest in me and return to their individual activities. Some were building with blocks, others gathering toys. All of it they were doing in complete silence. It was almost deafening how quiet it was. One boy, a 10-year-old, walked over to the arts and crafts and gathered some papers to begin to draw. I watched casually as he sketched out 8 stick figures in costumes, sitting around a circle, and I decided this was my moment to insert myself into the conversation. That's very good. Can you draw me too? I asked, pointing towards the center of the blank page. You don't belong there. Halloween time is just for us, the boy said simply, as instead he finished the 8 stick figures and had them holding hands like in a campfire circle. Really? Then, what are you drawing in the circle there? He started scribbling a man-like silhouette. Not saying a word, I watched as the drawing got larger and larger, and then he began to simply randomly scribble. Eventually he finished the main massive black blob and started scratching long etches towards each of the stick figures. They look like tendrils. What is that? I asked casually as he finished the drawing. It didn't look friendly any longer. Mr. Badbones. He's just here with us always, the boy answered. One of the girls grabbed the hold of her knees and cried a little. Does this Mr. Badbones hurt you? Not all the time, the boy said, shaking his head. He looked like he wanted to cry. And when does it hurt you? It took Dr. Hanlon away. It will take you away too, another girl whispered. I had read the report about my predecessor, but I still didn't understand how it could be connected to these children. He hadn't practiced here in some time. How do you know about that? Asked the girl. It doesn't like you, the boy said. He kept scratching at the drawing, boring a hole into the paper. The girl kept rocking. She was mumbling something. Dead now, dead here. Time for all the dead to cheer. Dead now, dead here. Time for all the dead to cheer, she whispered, over and over. Did you come from here? Another girl added. She looked about 5. No, sweetie, it's just a show. I promise I can be your friend. I didn't understand the connection yet, but what they were doing frightened me. No, 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 she said, as she started to pull her hair out. Then she kept repeating the song over and over. I just want to help. Another little boy with curly hair stood up and glared at me. You think we're lying? You think it's not real, just like the others? He shouted and accused. I'm here to help, I repeated. We don't want you here. Go away! Go away! Go away! Go away! He screamed as he started tossing toys at me. I stood up defensively and exited their circle, surprised that all of them showed the same anxious fear about my presence, like I was a threat. What had happened to them? I summoned the headmaster back and we discussed the procedures that I planned out for the week ahead. Where did this Halloween time come from? I asked. They had seen on the news about their old counselor, Dr. Hanlon. It seems like it triggered something. Well, that doesn't make sense. I did my research on the way over. What they're talking about, it doesn't exist. The headmaster bit her lip. I could tell she was holding something back. What haven't you mentioned? I asked coldly. I needed answers. Surprisingly, she gave them. They didn't want to tell you at first, but they all came from Asher Grove. I felt my mouth go dry. Suddenly, the trauma they had experienced made so much more sense. Asher Grove, if you're not familiar with it, is an unincorporated facility just west of here. It was meant to be a complex for a religious organization. In reality, it was a stronghold for a powerful cult. The things they did there, I couldn't even begin to describe. It also might explain some of their trauma, I thought, as I looked back in the room. The children were trying to hurt one another. Nurses rushed in to stop the violence, and I did my best to focus on the headmaster. When was this? About a year ago. Right around now. There are others we wanted to save, but circumstances didn't allow it, she explained softly. And you thought you could handle it yourself at first? They were never this way before. Just sort of spaced out. We thought they just needed time. Dr. Hanlon seemed to have a good grasp on them. And now he's likely in prison for attacking a mural, I muttered, shaking my head as I pondered over all these revelations. The children had stopped attacking one another thanks to the intervention of the nurses. Now they were all simply watching us like they wanted to be in our conversation. Some had scratch marks, or even one girl a bloody lip. Did they not recognize what they had done to themselves? Then they seemed to lose interest. The curly-haired boy that seemed against my arrival was beginning to play a game of Duck, Duck, Goose by using one of the toys as his instrument to pat his friend's head. It was a plastic toy used commonly for raking the sand to improve motor skills. Then, as he finished the game and chose one of his friends, the curly-haired boy started to bash the toy against the other child's head. "Good gracious!" the other nurse exclaimed as she ran into the room and pulled him away. Curly Hair started to kick and scratch as she did. I watched for a short time and then turned my attention back to the headmaster trying to shake away the oddness of the whole situation. The boy that was bleeding from his forehead hadn't even cried. I moved into the room, staring at the boy in disbelief. His werewolf costume now covered in his friend's blood. "What made you do that?" I asked. "Mr. Badbones," he whispered back. I felt a shudder as I realized these children seemed brainwashed. Then a nurse screamed, "Emma? Where's Emma?" We locked down the building and tried to find her. But the little girl had vanished. "She went to Halloween time," one of the girls told me as we gathered the others together. "And how does one get there?" I asked them. "Asher's," a boy whispered. The others seemed frightened by the mention of the name. Later that night, I watched the children on camera get into their beds. They were zombies, or maybe puppets. And I knew that meant someone was pulling the strings. It was all starting to come together, but not quite cohesively yet. If I was going to discover dark secrets of Halloween time, I had to find out what happened at Asher's Grove. I swallowed a gulp of air as I shuddered. Visiting a cult was not what I had in mind for a fall festival. While trying to control my younger siblings, I reached down and examined the large coat covered in fresh blood. Upon closer inspection, I realized that there were also pieces of bone sticking to it as though from a recent attack. It's also stuck in the jacket pocket a letter, torn and a bit faded, addressed to my mother. This is what it had to say. "To whom it may concern, I, Kenneth Avery, being of sound mind and body, do hereby relinquish all assets and properties attained by me during my tenure at Asher's Grove, and wish to announce my intention to resign from my position as data associate effective immediately, 2 weeks from now. I would like to take this time to express my thanks to each and every individual that helped me grow and adjust to this field of study. While I understand that this is a decision that affects my previously agreed upon 2-year contract, I've reviewed my options and believe that a change in perspective is necessary for me to continue to grow as an individual. If I can be of any use to select my replacement, please be sure to contact me post-haste. And again, with best regards and sincerest apologies, Dr. Kenneth Avery. As soon as I finished reading it, I felt guilty for finding it a bit amusing. Although intended for my mother, I knew that no one in the vicinity of Asher Grove would ever bother to read such a letter. It didn't seem right, though, to simply ignore it. If no one came forward about this, I knew that it could lead to lingering doubt and uncertainty, a feeling of abandonment. It was a feeling we knew too well. I didn't care about what people at Asher Grove felt, that's for sure. But I'm sure that Kenneth had relatives and family that needed to know what happened to him. This pain of abandonment is what we had carried for almost 2 years now. And if you were to understand the story of Dr. Avery, then you must know ours as well. On October 30th, 2018, I returned home from school, an ordinary teenager. It was the last good day that I would ever have, so I remember each and every detail. It was sunny and warm, which was a tad unusual for that time of year. Typically, spring is still cold here in northern Idaho. Dad let me ride to school with 2 of my best friends, Todd and Brittany. Todd had just gotten his driver's permit, and his parents were rich enough to afford him a brand new ride. I could still see myself sticking my hand out the window of the Ford Fusion, letting the wind rush through my fingers. At school, I called Mom, asking for permission to take part in a local 4K color run that would be that Saturday. To my surprise, she said yes, and even suggested that Todd give me a ride to the fairgrounds. Even the bad parts of that day seemed to have some ray of happiness to them, like during music class when a snotty girl pushed me aside to get to the front seat, and I almost fell gracefully into the arms of the senior hunk. Dad came to pick me up on his way to work as usual, and though I didn't notice, looking back now I recognize that the car ride was unusually silent. I remember asking him what was for dinner, and he claimed that Mom would be buying us a pizza from a local place, Gertie's. When I got home, there was a few simple chores for me to do, and then I got permission to go over to my friend Jennifer's house. We laughed and fiddled with our hair and watched some scary cartoons like typical teenagers until Mom called to tell me that it was time to come home. I'd eaten dinner at Jen's, so I hadn't even noticed when I got home that she hadn't ordered the pizza. She asked me to give my little brother Tim a bath because Dad had a flat at work and she had to go pick him up. It was the last time that I ever saw either one of my parents. When I think about what happened after that moment and all the pain we went through, it makes what we saw that day on the side of the road seem almost tame in comparison. Losing our parents has been the hardest thing that we've ever experienced, but now seeing this strange note attached to the bloody jacket, it made it all come full circle. Asher's Grove was a place that had taken our parents away from us. It's a closed-off community not far from here, a cult that dedicated itself to reviving ancient pagan traditions relating to Halloween. Many people over the years have been allured by the mysterious parties they held every year at the end of October, and it entrapped our parents. Police have tried to get a warrant for the facility, but unfortunately the majority of the local police force seemed to be in the cult's pocket. Whatever had happened to our parents, they were officially declared missing that Halloween. I dialed 911 while Gabby climbed over my back time and time again, pretending that I was some sort of horse to be ridden. And finally, after the 10th climb, and listening to the most annoying elevator music ever, I found myself speaking to an older officer who called himself Sam. I briefly explained my reason for calling, even apologized for delaying in making the call, all of which he understood. He paused for a second and said that he needed to go check something. And then, when he returned, he asked if I was serious. His tone had changed slightly, and I asked him, was something wrong? He told me that a body had been found and identified as that of Kenneth Avery. Then he bid me good day. I thought about the bloody jacket. Maybe he had tried to escape the cult. I mean, with Halloween right around the corner, perhaps he knew something sinister was about to occur. There was something odd about the way the letter was written, too. It didn't sound typical of a note to be given for severance. It was more like a will and testament. As though Dr. Avery had decided he was leaving and he knew he wasn't coming back. The cult saw to it that he couldn't live a life outside the facility. Was this the same fate that had taken our parents away? Tim and Gabby cried as we sat in the cold shelter, and I looked up more information about the upcoming Halloween time event the cult had planned. They did it every year. They invited everyone in the area. Most were smart enough to ignore it because someone knew that most of these invites never returned. The cult either brainwashed or killed them. I was sure. But something told me that whatever Kenneth had discovered, it had something to do with this event. I looked up articles from a nearby RTC to see if there was anything there, and sure enough, found a missing person report filed by an attending only a week ago. I decided to reach out to them and explain the odd circumstances of how I'd come in contact with Kenneth. But their response was not one that I had anticipated. I've come to terms with what the children have done. I appreciate you being kind enough to explain one reason for this departure, even if it doesn't answer any of the others. Kenneth was a quiet man who said little but loved much, and I think that's what we miss most. The kind heart like yours, I'm sure that you'll understand that now we simply want to be left alone. Don't bother to go find him or search for any answers on your own. All you'll find is evil in that place. I asked if she wanted to stay in touch, but she didn't see any reason for us to. Not over something like this. It could only make her hurt more. I understood her pain all too well, especially sitting there typing back a response as Gabby slept against my side, and Tim cried for another bottle. Although she didn't say it in so many words, I knew the reason for her reluctance to talk. It was a reluctance I shared too often with anyone who asked me about my own past. When he had left, he told no one. He simply did so, uncaring about the results of such a callous action, unconcerned with what he had left behind. Dr. Avery had abandoned everything, only concerned with his mission. Why then had he even bothered to write the letter? It felt so pointless, so futile, perhaps most irritating of all, so selfish. It felt like he was laughing at all of us, making the pain seep into our skin. Worst of all, it felt all too familiar. I kept the letter my mother had written for their departure to Asher's Grove. Trying to forget about it, but it's like an old wound, but never healed. It won't heal. Even after I scrapped the note, the pain it gave me still remained. It was amazing how this man I had never met was having an impact on my thoughts. How much I related to this pain. Finally, I started to realize that I was emulating the feelings I felt for the letter itself. I was being pointless, futile, childish, no better than them. I wasn't going to get over this until I found out. Until I found out what happened to my parents, or Dr. Avery at Asher's Grove. I looked down at my younger siblings and I ruffled their hair, knowing I couldn't just leave them here. I needed to forget about this and move on, and that's what I tried to do, but the cult had other plans. That night, early trick-or-treating was going on in our neighborhood, and Tim and Gabby and I had to take shelter somewhere else. The winds were cold as we walked empty streets, but cold wasn't what bothered me. It was the fact that as we moved out of the way of these costumed kids, they were choosing to follow us. I tugged at Gabby and Tim and encouraged them to move faster. I looked back to see if we were still being followed. Then I was struck by something straight in front of me. I toppled over and looked up at the strangely dressed man. His costume was as dark as the night around us and resembled something I had seen in a distant dream.
You were never supposed to leave.
His voice rattled inside my brain. Then he grabbed the hold of my shirt and pulled Gabby towards him. I screamed and I tried to stop it from happening, but it was too late. He yanked her from my arms and I watched in shock as it seemed to absorb her into his costume. He grew larger as he grabbed a hold of Tim and did the same, and all I could do was stand there and shake helplessly as my two siblings were taken by this monster. Around me, the other costumed children made a circle. I wondered if this was the same way that Dr. Avery had been killed when he tried to uncover the truth.
The children belong to me. It is nearly time. Nearly Halloween time.
The monster cackled. And I blacked out. The next thing I knew, I was over at the nearby Miracle Clinic being evaluated. Surprisingly, they didn't take my phone away, but it still doesn't make my fresh pain go away. The room I'm in is marred with strange art resembling this strange cartoon. How could something so fake feel so real? Did the cult do this, or was it from my own hand? The door opens and a man with a long white lab coat enters the room. He adjusts his glasses and looks at the cartoon, smiling softly before asking me a simple question. Are you ready to go back? Go back where? I ask with dry mouth. I notice one of the drawings looks like Tim and Gabby running off towards a haunted house. Asher's Grove, the man whispers. That's where they are, he adds. I'm gonna take his hand and meet my family again. I know this is fate. I ran for a whole year, but now Halloween can't be avoided any longer. They used a small VFD in the smack middle of nowhere. Gritty red bricks and slanted broken metal tiles gave it this certain aesthetic feeling of nostalgia mixed with neglect. There were 5 other cars parked outside when we arrived. I knew one of the others from school. One of them, Ken, I had talked to. He was pretty chill, and I figured I would just hang near him after my parents left. The 5 of us were standing there awkwardly for a moment, alone, and I almost considered making a run for it. They wouldn't know, I told myself, or might not even care. Each of us was told to bring a costume from home, something that represented the fear that we were trying to overcome. I had brought a skeleton one from an old cartoon that had once given me nightmares. Ken was wearing a lab coat, like he was a doctor. The 2 girls were both dressed as witches, twins, and I could hardly tell them apart. I'm Melody, and this is my friend Jen. Is this your first chance to experience Asher's Grove? The girl said with a giggle. Something about her laugh seemed off. Before I could answer, we heard a shuffling of feet from the front of the building. It sounded like a clicking noise, a clinking and clanky way of walking, and a moment later, I realized why. Our instructor was walking with a cane. Welcome, children, my teacher said as they leaned against the cane and loomed over all of us. They were wearing what looked like a cape, black cloak, and a glow-in-the-dark costume that resembled my own. It sent a shiver down my spine how sinister they appeared. It was all they said before promptly walking inside and turning on the lights in the facility. The 5 of us followed inside, and I looked around some of the workstations that were presented to us. For some odd reason, there were various embalmed animals lying on the floor, as though brought from a taxidermist office, and I immediately felt uneasy. It didn't look like it had anything to do with Halloween. What is this? I asked. Your assignment for today, the teacher said simply. The instructor offered us tools, what appeared to be surgical instruments of some kind, and then explained, in the real world, the first lesson you must learn is that life is not fair. These poor creatures had their lives snuffed out from them. They didn't have a choice on how they would die. And ultimately, neither do you. Jennifer laughed. Are you fucking serious? You're meant to be molded by society, whether you like it or not. You have roles to play, whether as a doctor, a psychiatrist, or even two young twins. These are roles you can't escape simply because you want to, the older man said. He turned towards us and smiled grimly as he took one of the animals and began to change its shape as though it were merely clay. You're feeling confused. You're asking yourself, why are you here? If any of this is even real, the teacher said softly as they walked to the door and locked it. The fact is that each choice that you made has consequences, and those should also be clear to you. What we present to you in this program is for you to realize what choices are the best ones to make. The ones that led you here. Alright, I'll bite. What does the dissecting dead animals thing have to do with troubles that we have at home or school? What do you mean, led you here? Our parents brought us, dipshit, Ken said. This is more than just make-believe. Halloween is real. The program is meant to reshape your entire process of how you think. Accept that your life can be shaped the way it's meant to be. And you will see that the impossibilities are endless, the teacher reassured us. But it didn't sound that way at all. He was saying one thing, but I could tell that he meant something else entirely. The instructor moved to the back of the room and took a seat while the five of us that remained tried to decide what to do. I looked down at the sculpture, feeling a faint memory prick under my skin. Was he saying that we had all been here before? I told my mom this was a stupid idea. You'll build character, she said. Dumb shit. Ken lamented as he sat down at the table. This was good enough for me. I knew that while the program was voluntary, the teacher likely would give a report to both the school and to my parents. As odd as this task was for us, I didn't see much harm in it, so I took some of the instruments and got to work. An hour passed by, and then 2. It was time for my parents to come back and get me. As the clock hand drifted towards the next half hour, I decided to bring up the issue with our teacher. Excuse me, I don't mean to be rude, but shouldn't you call our parents? I asked. The elderly man leaned forward. He was looking amused. Now why would I do that? He asked. Ken, Melody, and Greg were taking notes of our conversation now because of his strange response. It's getting late, Ken said as though it were obvious. In fact, I could already see some of the sensors going on outside the small building. It was very dark. I had hoped to go trick-or-treating. You won't be going home. You can call them if you like. If they still remember you. He sneered. Melody slipped out her smartphone and gave a ring to her mom. Hey, where are you? The next few seconds, I watched as her face went from one of puzzlement to disbelief. What the hell? What do you mean you don't know who this is? Mom, this isn't funny, she said as she walked about the room. I was busy finishing my dissection as the instructor stopped by to give it a look. You should stop. You're only ruining the work, he corrected me. Then he coughed to get everyone's attention as Melody paced the room. You should know that everything is as it should be. There's no need for concern or alarm. You will be staying here. I've made arrangements for you to sleep in the cots in the attic. And tomorrow, we'll be checking out the forest for more samples. What? We can't stay here. Ken was dumbfounded. I think you'll find that you can. And that you will, the old man responded. I heard a low rumble of thunder and frowned in desperation. There's a storm rolling in. Maybe the roads are closed, and that's why our folks couldn't get here, I guessed. It was a flimsy excuse, but it was all I could offer. In reality, it felt as though something beyond our control was happening. And I thought I heard the old man snicker in delight as Jen and Melody began to whimper. "Good night, my children." He went to a stairwell, and we watched as he descended towards the basement. Finally alone, Melody made a bold accusation. "Is this guy trying to freak us out or something? I mean, it is Halloween. Maybe this was part of overcoming our fears. It's probably part of this program. It's whatever. I'm sure our folks probably are laughing their heads off, probably right now, about all of this. I mean, I swear, when I get home in the morning, I'm gonna make their lives hell." Jen promised. I could tell she was trying to sound confident, when none of us really knew for sure what was going on, especially as the hours started to tick by. The dark of the night loomed over Asher's Grove, and we felt trapped. Maybe we actually were. The storm raged louder that night, and on until daybreak. Somewhere amid the crashes and the cold, I heard Melody whispering to herself. "Dead. Now. Dead here. Now we all have reason to cheer." Was she going insane? I looked down at her bed and froze in place. It looked like she was starting to fade away. Her eyes bulged open and we locked eyes with one another. "Don't be afraid. We'll be together soon." And then she was gone. I clung to my bed and tried to calm down. This had to be a bad dream. By morning, I thought things would definitely make more sense. 6 o'clock, and we were awoken to the soft clanging of metal against wood. Our instructor was making a racket to get us up. "We're going for a walk," he told all of us, and then led the way. But I wasn't moving until I knew what happened to Melody. "Where is she?" I demanded. The old man looked even more like his costume, like it was sticking to his skin. "Her story is over now," was all he replied. Weirder still, the others didn't seem to care. The air was still damp, and he pointed towards the nearby bay where the fire trucks normally parked. "My children, you'll find some baskets in here, and a wheelbarrow. You'll need them for the task at hand," he said. He kept walking, fully expecting us to comply. I turned to Jen and tried to get her attention. "Hey, aren't you worried about her? She's your friend." Jen, however, seemed to be in a daze. "What am I supposed to do?" Ken helped me with the wheelbarrow. The ground was a bit muddy to push it. Felt like carrying a ton of bricks for half a mile. We strayed from the roads and into the menagerie of forest that thickened around the east. A gentle fog was rolling across our feet as the instructor told us where to start to pick up lumber. "Nature has a way of putting us in our place. We have so much to learn from them. If only we listened to the silence of their suffering," he said as we set back about our task. "Nature doesn't ask where it should be planted, or if it's meant to be. It simply accepts the circumstances and survives. Nature always thrives in any environment, any condition. There are no mistakes in nature." Greg was wandering a bit from the group. I was about to call him back when I heard the scream. Dropping the basket, I ran to his aid. Then I saw what caused his outburst. There, in the ravine below, Jen was sprawled out, dead, and bruised from some vicious attack. Our teacher slowly walked over to see what the fuss was about, and Greg pulled out his phone, struggling to get a signal. "No damn reception out here," he muttered. Are the bears around here?" Ken asked nervously. "We have to do something," I insisted as I moved the wheelbarrow. "Halloween time is here. All the stories are being told," the instructor said mystically as Ken and I lifted Jen up into the wheelbarrow. "This was her time," he added in a stronger tone. "Like hell it was. She didn't know that she'd get mauled by a mountain lion," Ken muttered.
None of us know where fate will take us. Nature took its course with her. What do you think it tells you that you feel inclined to do something with her now, after the fact?
The teacher asked. I have a sense of decency, Ken spat back, and then helped us to push the wheelbarrow back to VFD. I still can't get a signal, Greg lamented as we walked. I could feel the old man's eyes watching us as we pushed our corpse away from the woods. He was judging our actions. When I looked back again, Greg was gone. And in his place, a wooden effigy. Ken, we have to get out of here. A few hours later, we were confirmed. The phone lines were down. The storm had knocked them out, and the VFD was running on an auxiliary generator. Our teacher returned shortly afterward, bringing a few knives and other instruments before remarking,
You two will be next. It can't be a story until all the characters play their part.
Kenny's mouth was agape. What is wrong with you? Right, this isn't a game. All our friends are dying. Our instructor went to his workspace and began to sharpen his blade. As he closed the door, I heard something move inside. What the hell was that? I asked. And then,
Did you know that in the old days, when one of the tribe got sick, the others would offer it as a sacrifice to the gods to appease them? They felt that the weak only destabilized the structure of the entire group. So they sought balance. They sought to control a situation by appeasing a force beyond their control.
Ken slammed his fist down and glared at him. Don't talk in riddles. What the hell does that mean for us? Why are we still here? The instructor turned to us and I felt my stomach hollow as I realized he had been using his knife to carve at his mouth. He looked exactly like the dark demon from my dreams, like the cartoon I had tried to forget.
You never left, my children,
he cackled as he towered over us. I felt like I could cry, a sickening feeling twisting in my stomach as he took the blade and then slammed it straight into Ken's body. I was numb to the fact that he too was now fading.
My children, once you learn that everything in this world has its place to what is and is not possible, you will see that you have the capability of fulfilling any dream you have ever had. Your future is going to begin right here, and you will be responsible for it. Together, we will make it possible. Together, we are Halloween time.
I stared back at him and I felt my body go numb. He was expecting me to blindly obey.
This is where we all began, and where it all ends. There is no escape. It was only here, and now,
the monster said. The world around seemed to melt and conform into abstract shapes. I knew he was preparing to kill me too, make me a part of this twisted story, the one that he had designed. But no, something inside me chose to fight. I grabbed the small knife he had used to dissect the animals, and I raced towards him, listening as he cackled madly. The room kept melting, and I kept screaming, and I wasn't going to let my story end here. I closed my eyes, and I kept stabbing. Until the laughter stopped. And then I opened them, and I realized I was alone. The faculty was gone, my friends, and the instructors too. I was alone. I walked for miles down a deserted road until I found a rest stop, and then I made a call. Getting the police to come pick me up, I just wanted to go home, but they insisted on asking questions. I told them about Asher's Grove and the strange Halloween time show that apparently my instructor had tried to bring to life. They didn't ask questions, they just listened.
And when it was over and done, they went to talk to each other for a moment, and I knew what they must be thinking. I'm crazy. And maybe I am. I don't know anymore. A moment later, they told me what I was anticipating, or at least I thought they would. Do you remember how you got to this grove? They asked. No, my parents, I think. We've been checking our database. There's no record of you or any of your friends, or even Asher Grove. I felt numb again as I looked at the data myself. How could that be? How could it all cease to exist? They let me go, and I thanked them for listening, but I felt even more lost than before. All that was left to remember any of this by was a notebook filled with memories. The only thing from the grove that hadn't faded away. Inside, there were cartoonish drawings, showing me my friends, all of them playing happily in costume. And the final page had a message. Join us next time for an exciting episode of your own, it said. And I thought about it. Maybe next year I would do just that. I mean, after all, if I'm not meant to be real, if we're all part of this evil, it's better if I fade away, right? All I ask for anyone still paying attention, stop watching. Halloween time is over. For now.
Hey there, kids, and happy Halloween. It's me, MrCreepyPasta, and I wanted to tell you thank you so much for watching tonight's video, or listening to tonight's episode, this Oktoberfest, on the podcast. If you're not listening on the podcast, then you always can listen on the podcast at Spotify, or just about anywhere you find a podcast. And if you're not listening on YouTube, then you can find it on YouTube, or just about anywhere you find a YouTube. I just want to remind all of you that if you're on a cold autumn night and you need a warm drink, that my wife sells tea. There's tea available at etsy.com/shop/ivory-monocle-tea. All different kinds, including those themed off of creepypastas, horror icons, horror monsters, and Dungeons & Dragons. And if you order that creepypasta set with the Mr. Creepypasta's Dark and Stormy Night, the actual tea that I drink while recording these stories, well, probably about 60% of the time, then you can always ask for that MCP dabbing sticker instead of the classic channel icon sticker. And I get a kick out of it every time someone asks her to do that. Also, I wanted to say thank you, all of you who are supporting me on Patreon. That's patreon.com/MrCreepyPasta. If you ever want to help support the show, keep the lights on, feed my cats and the like, you can always head over to patreon.com/MrCreepyPasta, and you can support the show there. Even $1 is greatly appreciated. And I have a very special thank you to these guys, such as Jordan Alexander Sanchez, Mr. Thud, Ken Lando Higuchi, Champinski, Nico Kaio, Tristan Pelton, Stephen Van Huss, Chance Burnett, Deanna Kraus, G. Weevil 3, The Red Oak Shield Virus, Corey Kenshin, Pothead Holmes, Rival 1, Jimbo the Hutt, Caspian, Jordan Nels, The Village Witch, Hades' Nephew, Jordan Wayne Deckart, Bradley Lipe, Ann Charan, Acid System, Mike Bullock, Fooly Cooly Dude, Prozac and Pancake Appreciation, Brian Arse, Cryptic Nightmares, Shadow Morningstar, Brianna Wright, Someone You Love, Seb the King 56, Bad Honey, S-Man, Kiri the Sloth, Thomas Burgett, Liam Newman, Sky Harbor, Caleb Dougal, Last Blade Song, Rafael Rodriguez, The Ginger Bros, and Aaron Stormcrow. And another thank you to all you guys who are in the description down below. Thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you all for listening. And I hope you all have a wonderfully happy Halloween. Sweet dreams.